A man looked at her and said bluntly, "I don't hire women with children." She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She simply said, "Give me 60 seconds." It was a winter evening in 1887, and no one at Black Ridge Ranch knew that the woman standing at the door with a 7-year-old child in her arms would be the only one who could save the entire ranch from collapse. This is the story of Evelyn Mercer, a woman no one wanted, but everyone needed. Hit a like, comment the city you're viewing from so I know how far this story has come. And don't leave, because the best part is yet to come. The wagon seat was hard as courthouse stone, and Evelyn Mercer had been sitting on it for 11 hours. She'd counted, not because she had nothing else to think about, but because counting hours was the one thing she could control. The miles falling away behind the wheels, the sky darkening from pale blue to bruised purple, the temperature dropping in that particular way it did on the high plains when winter wasn't threatening anymore. It was arriving. Lucy had fallen asleep somewhere around mile 40, her head wedged against Evelyn's hip, her breath making small white clouds that dissolved before they reached the canvas above them. The driver, an old man named Cutter who smelled of pipe tobacco and wet wool, had stopped talking around noon. That suited Evelyn fine. She had too much to think about, and not enough of it was good. The letter from Black Ridge Ranch had been precise. Cook needed. Room and board provided. Wages negotiable upon interview. Reply promptly to Cole Barrett, proprietor. She'd replied promptly. She'd listed her qualifications honestly. 12 years cooking professionally, 6 of them managing a hotel kitchen in Abilene, fluent in quantity preparation, experienced with preservation, willing to work the full seasonal calendar. She had not mentioned Lucy. Not out of deception, exactly. Out of calculation. She'd been turned down enough times to know that the mention of a child in a letter was the same as writing, "Don't bother reading further across the top of the page." She would explain in person. People were harder to dismiss face to face. That had been her reasoning, and she still believed it was sound reasoning. Whether Cole Barrett would agree was a different question entirely. Cutter pulled the horses up at the crest of a low ridge and pointed into the darkness below. "That's her," he said. Black Ridge. Evelyn looked. There were lights. 4 or 5 yellow squares of window lights scattered across what seemed like a considerable stretch of ground. A large main building, low and long. Outbuildings behind it, barely visible. Fences running off into the dark. A windmill standing still in the cold air. It was not impressive exactly, but it was solid. It looked like something a person had built carefully and meant to keep. "How far?" she asked. 10 minutes, maybe. Road gets rough near the bottom." Lucy stirred. "Are we there?" "Almost," Evelyn said. She put her hand on her daughter's head for a moment, feeling the warmth of her through the wool hat. "Fix your coat." The road did get rough near the bottom. The wagon lurched and tilted, and Lucy grabbed Evelyn's arm with both hands and didn't say anything, which was very Lucy. She didn't cry at things that were merely uncomfortable. She'd learned that early, and Evelyn wasn't entirely sure whether to be proud of that or sad about it. Probably both. Cutter brought the wagon to a stop in front of the main building. Before Evelyn could climb down, the front door opened and a man came out. He was tall. That was the first thing she noticed, tall and broad across the shoulders, wearing a canvas jacket with the collar turned up. He was carrying a lantern and he held it up as he came toward the wagon, squinting against his own light. He looked to be somewhere in his late 30s, maybe 40, with the kind of face that had been weathered by outdoor work rather than age. Creased around the eyes, jaw set in a way that suggested it was often set that way. He stopped when the lantern light reached the wagon, and he saw Evelyn. Then he saw Lucy. There was a pause. Not long, but long enough. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. It wasn't a question exactly. More like a man confirming something he was already regretting. "Mr. Barrett," she said. She climbed down without waiting for help, which wasn't pride so much as habit. She hadn't had anyone to help her down from wagons for 2 years, and waiting for help from someone who might not offer it was just an efficient way to feel worse about things. She reached up and helped Lucy down. "This is my daughter Lucy. She's 7. Cole Barrett looked at the child for a moment. Then he looked at Evelyn. His expression was not angry, which she'd prepared herself for. It was something more complicated than that, a kind of flat, careful neutrality that people wore when they were thinking something they hadn't decided yet whether to say. "Your letter didn't mention a child," he said. "No, Evelyn agreed. It didn't. Another pause. Cutter was already unhitching the horses, making himself very busy and very far away in the way of a man who recognized the opening notes of a disagreement and wanted no part of it. I don't run a family operation, Cole said. I run a working ranch. I've got 11 men here. The kitchen is a working kitchen, not a household. I understand that. A child would be a disruption. She won't be, Evelyn said. Lucy is quiet, she's self-sufficient, and she's been in working environments since she was 4. She won't bother your men, and she won't get in anyone's way. You can't know that. I can, actually. I know my daughter. She heard the edge in her own voice and made herself soften it slightly. Not because she was backing down, but because sharpness wasn't going to serve her here. Mr. Barrett, I understand this isn't what you expected. I'm asking for 60 seconds to tell you what I can do for this ranch, and then you can make whatever decision you think is right. He looked at her for a long moment. The lantern light moved in the wind, throwing shadows across his face. Then he said, 60 seconds. I've been cooking professionally since I was 19. I ran the kitchen at the Harlow Hotel in Abilene for 6 years. 60 covers at breakfast, 90 at dinner, 7 days a week, for 4 of those years with an understaffed crew and a budget that was cut twice. I know how to feed working men, how to make a dollar stretch without making the food suffer, how to manage provisions for a full winter, and how to run a kitchen so it doesn't create problems for the rest of a working operation. I'm not asking you to take a chance on an unknown. I'm asking you to look at my references, which are in that bag, and make your decision based on what's actually in front of you. He said nothing for a moment. What happened to your husband? He asked. It wasn't what she'd expected him to say. He died, she said, 18 months ago, fever. I'm sorry. So was I. She didn't say it coldly, just honestly. Cole Barrett looked at Lucy again. The girl was standing very still beside her mother, holding her small bag with both hands, looking at the ranch owner with the kind of direct, measuring look that children sometimes had, unfiltered and completely unintimidated. He seemed to notice the look because something in his expression shifted slightly. Kitchen's through the main house, he said. You can look at it tonight. I'll give you a week's trial. If the men are satisfied and the operation runs clean, we'll talk about terms. That's fair, Evelyn said. There's a small room off the kitchen. It's used for storage right now, but there's space enough. You and the girl can have it for the week. Thank you. He turned and started back toward the door, then stopped and turned back part way. The men eat at 5:30 in the morning and 6 in the evening. They take lunch in the field when they're working far out. There's an inventory of what's in the larder. It's on the kitchen table. I'll look at it tonight, she said. He nodded once and went inside. Evelyn picked up her bag and took Lucy's hand and followed him. The kitchen was not what she would have chosen, but it was workable. That was the honest assessment, made in the light of a single kerosene lamp, while Lucy sat on top of a flour barrel and watched her mother move through the space with the focused efficiency of someone conducting an audit. The cook stove was large, a good Monarch range, older but well made, and it was dirty. The grates were clogged with ash, the warming oven had a residue she didn't want to think too hard about, and the firebox door had a warped hinge that would need to be dealt with. The work surfaces were adequate. The hanging pot rack had gaps where pieces were missing. The floor hadn't been properly scrubbed in what she estimated was several months. But the bones were good. The space was arranged logically. The larder off the back was generous in size, even if its current contents were in no particular order. And there was an exterior door to the wood supply, which meant she wouldn't have to carry logs through the main house. Whoever had designed this kitchen had known what they were doing, even if whoever had been using it recently hadn't. She found the inventory on the table, as promised. She read it carefully. Then she read it again. Mama, Lucy said. Is he mean? The tall man? Evelyn considered this. No, she said. I don't think he's mean. I think he's used to things being a certain way, and he didn't expect us. He looked at me funny. He wasn't sure what to make of you. Because I'm a kid? Because you weren't part of his plan. She set the inventory down and looked at her daughter. People don't always know what to do when something doesn't fit their plan. That doesn't mean they're unkind. It just means they need a little time. Lucy thought about this. Do you think he'll let us stay? That depends on us, Evelyn said. Not on him. She rolled up her sleeves and found a bucket and went to work on the stove. She was up before 4. She hadn't slept more than 2 hours, but she'd learned years ago that sleep was a negotiable commodity when there was work to be done. And tonight there was a great deal of work to be done. She'd spent 3 hours cleaning the stove and the work surfaces, reorganizing the larder by category and frequency of use, identifying what was missing, and sketching out a rough menu plan for the first week based on what was actually available. She'd found several things of interest during the reorganization. 4 tins of sardines that had been buried behind a sack of cornmeal, a partial wheel of good hard cheese that someone had wrapped incorrectly and which was drying out but salvageable, dried apples, and ties behind a box of rusted nails that had no business being in a kitchen larder, a glass jar of rendered beef tallow that would make her biscuit making considerably easier than she'd anticipated. She'd also found the supply ledger tucked behind a row of canned tomatoes, as though it had been put there rather than misplaced. She'd looked at it for a long time. She'd set it aside. There would be time for that later. By 4:15, she had the firebox going and the stove beginning to heat. By 4:30, she had a pot of coffee on and cornbread batter mixed. By 5, she had 6 dozen biscuits in 2 stages of preparation, a pot of dried pinto beans that had been soaking since midnight now simmering with salt pork and onion, a pan of thick sliced side bacon laid out and ready, and a large iron skillet heating on the back burner for eggs. She'd found a crock of butter that was acceptable, a tin of sorghum, and a jar of preserved plum preserves that someone had put up last summer and apparently forgotten entirely. At 5:15, she heard the first stirrings from the bunkhouse. At 5:20, a knock at the kitchen door. She opened it. The man standing there was short and wiry, somewhere around 50, with a face like a walnut and eyes that moved quickly. He had his hat in his hands. He looked past her into the kitchen and visibly registered the smell. The coffee, the bacon, the biscuits just pulled from the oven. And something happened in his expression that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, but something in between. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm Hector. I do for Mr. Barrett around the house. Usually I put the coffee on." "I've got it," she said. "Come in. Is there a serving arrangement? Do the men come to the kitchen, or is there a dining area?" "There's a room off the main hall. Long table. We eat in there." "Show me and we'll get it set up." His name was Hector Vega, she learned in the next few minutes, and he had worked for Cole Barrett for 9 years. He was not unfriendly, but he was watchful, the way of a person who had learned to see which way a thing was going to fall before committing to catching it. He showed her the dining room, which was plain and functional and had a long pine table that could seat 14, and he helped her carry the serving pieces without being asked, which she noted. "How many men today?" she asked. 11, counting Mr. Barrett." "Well, 11 and 2. He glanced toward the kitchen, where Lucy was now awake and sitting at the small prep table with a piece of bread Evelyn had cut for her. "I guess 12 and a half. 11 and 2 is fine," Evelyn said. "I've cooked for larger." By 5:30, she had the dining room set and the food laid. She stood back and looked at the table. It was not fancy. It was biscuits and bacon and eggs and beans and coffee and butter and sorghum, which was exactly what working men on a cold morning needed and nothing more. But there was enough of it, and it was hot, and the kitchen behind her was clean, and she stood straight when the dining room door opened and the first men came in. They came in the way working ranch hands always came in, a little loud, a little rough, not paying much attention to anything except the table and the coffee. And then they slowed. Not because of her exactly, because of the biscuits. She watched several of them clock the biscuits from across the room with the particular focused attention of men who had been eating bad biscuits for an extended period. "Lord Almighty," said a tall red-headed man, reaching past 2 others to get to the basket. He took 2, looked at them, bit into one, and stopped moving for a moment. "Who made these?" "I did," Evelyn said. He turned and really looked at her for the first time. "You're the new cook?" "I am. Evelyn Mercer." "Pete Callahan." He held up the biscuit as though presenting evidence. "Mrs. Mercer, whatever Barrett's paying you, it's not enough." There was a general sound of agreement around the table as plates were filled and coffee was poured, and Evelyn felt something in her shoulders loosen very slightly. Not relief, she hadn't been worried about the biscuits, but there was a kind of particular tension that she'd carried through the night that she hadn't fully identified until it let go. And now that it had, she recognized it for what it was. The tension of not knowing whether you would be allowed to prove yourself before being dismissed. They had not dismissed her. Not yet. That was enough for now. She was carrying the empty first coffee pot back toward the kitchen when she noticed the man who hadn't said anything. He was sitting at the far end of the table, and he was eating, but he was also watching her in a way that was different from the others. Not hostile exactly, but measuring. Not the same measuring that Hector did, which was the measuring of a cautious man deciding whether to trust. This was the measuring of a person who had already made a judgment and was looking for confirmation of it. He was older than the others, maybe 60, with a gray beard trimmed close and hands like two pieces of old leather. He caught her looking at him and didn't look away. She didn't either. Cole Barrett came in last, which she'd half expected. He filled his plate without ceremony, poured his own coffee, and sat at the head of the table. He ate for a few minutes without speaking, which seemed to be his habit, and then he looked up at her across the length of the room. "These are better than what we've been eating," he said. "I'd hope so," she said. "I found what was in the larder. What happened to the last cook?" "He quit in September, said the winters were too hard." "Has it been you managing the kitchen since September?" "Hector mostly, and whoever wasn't busy." She nodded. That explained certain things about the condition of the larder and the stove. "I'll put together a list of what needs to be resupplied before the weather closes in. How often does a wagon go to town?" "Twice a month in good weather. Once when the roads get bad." "When do the roads get bad?" "Could be 3 weeks, could be 2. Then I need to get the list to you today," she said. "Some of what's in that larder right now won't last the winter without resupply, and some of what would last the winter isn't there." Cole looked at her for a moment. "You went through the larder last night?" "I went through everything last night." He held her gaze for a moment longer, then looked back at his plate. "Get me the list by noon." She went back to the kitchen. Behind her, she heard Pete Callahan say, quiet enough to think she wouldn't hear, "I like her." The old man at the end of the table, she still didn't know his name, said nothing at all. His name, she learned by mid-morning, was Silas Boone. She learned it from Pete Callahan, who turned out to be the kind of man who would tell you anything you needed to know if you just waited long enough and listened without seeming too interested. He came back to the kitchen at 9 on the pretext of needing an extra mug of coffee, which he didn't, and ended up sitting on the stool near the exterior door for 20 minutes, while Evelyn made bread, and Lucy helped by handing her things when asked. "Silas has been here since the start," Pete said. "Before me, before most of the men. He was here when Cole's father ran the place. He takes that seriously." "Takes what seriously?" "The way things are done, the way things have always been done. He's not a bad man. I want to be clear about that. He's got a picture of what Black Ridge is supposed to look like, and he's not always easy about it when the picture changes." "And does the picture change often?" Pete considered this. "Not often. Cole's not a man who likes change either, generally speaking. He's practical, He doesn't go looking for new ways to do things. He goes looking for what works." He glanced at Lucy, who was carefully lining up a row of dried beans on the edge of the prep table, doing something private and elaborate that children did when they were waiting for adults to stop talking about them. He didn't say anything this morning when the girl was in the kitchen. That's something coming from him. He said she'd be a disruption. He says a lot of things at first. Pete drained his mug and stood up. Last cook he had before the one who quit, a man named Gould, that man could barely boil water. We ate bad food for 2 years because Cole wanted someone who fit the job description he had in his head. Finally got bad enough that the men started losing patience. He set the mug on the counter. "These biscuits, though. These biscuits are going to help your case considerably." "My case isn't about biscuits," Evelyn said. "No," Pete agreed, "but biscuits don't hurt." After he left, Lucy looked up from her beans. "What's a case?" "A reason," Evelyn said. "Like an argument for something." "Are you arguing?" "Not yet. Bob." She had the supply list done by 11 and put it on Cole's desk herself after asking Hector where the office was. She did not wait to be given permission. The office was a room off the main hall with the door open, and the desk had a clear space on one corner, and leaving the list required approximately 30 seconds. She had used those 30 seconds to observe that the office contained, in addition to the desk and 2 chairs, a set of shelves with ledger books, a county map pinned to the wall, and a corkboard covered with papers that included what appeared to be land survey documents. She did not study those, but she registered them. Lunch was not a formal meal. The men who were out working took sandwiches and cold biscuits, and the two men who came back to the main building at noon got soup and bread and ate in the kitchen without ceremony. Evelyn used the midday quiet to begin her preparation for dinner and to think about the supply ledger she'd found behind the tomatoes. She hadn't mentioned it to Cole. She wasn't sure yet whether she should. What she'd seen in it was not necessarily her business. She was a cook on a week's trial, not an accountant, not a manager, not someone whose opinion had been invited about how the ranch's money was being spent. But what she'd seen in it was also difficult to simply set aside, because it was not the kind of thing you could look at and then not know. The numbers didn't add up, not in the way that numbers sometimes got sloppy in a working operation where nobody was paying very close attention. These numbers didn't add up in a specific, consistent direction, which was a different thing entirely. She decided to look at it again that evening, after dinner. If she was right about what she thought she was seeing, she would need to be certain before she said anything. And if she was right and she did say something, she would need to do it carefully, because accusing a person of being defrauded, or worse, suggesting that someone they trusted was responsible, was not a conversation that tended to go smoothly, no matter how well you'd prepared for it. She put it out of her mind and concentrated on dinner. Dinner was the real test, and she knew it. Breakfast had been about proving she could produce something edible on short notice with an unfamiliar kitchen. Dinner was about proving she could cook, actually cook, not just assemble. She had 11 working men to feed after a full day of hard physical labor, men who had been eating indifferently for months, and who had recalibrated their expectations downward in that way. Hungry people sometimes did, where they stopped hoping for good food and just hoped for enough food. She intended to change that calibration tonight. She made a beef stew that she'd been building since early afternoon. A proper stew, not the thin, brothy version that passed for stew in operations that didn't want to spend the time or the ingredients. She'd browned the meat in batches so it developed a crust, built the base with the rendered onion and some of the root vegetables she'd found in the root cellar, added dried herbs and a splash of the apple cider vinegar that was in the larder and that most people thought was only good for pickling, and let it go low and slow for 4 hours. She made cornbread to go with it and a pot of boiled dried apples with cinnamon for after, which was not a sophisticated dessert but was hot and sweet and would be welcome on a cold evening. She also made the biscuits again because Pete Callahan was right that biscuits didn't hurt. The men came in from the day, cold, dirty, moving with the particular heavy tiredness of people who had been outdoors in hard weather for 10 hours. And they sat down and they ate, and for a while the dining room was very quiet in the way of a room where people are concentrating. Then Pete said, "I will eat this stew every day until I die, and that will not be a complaint." A man named Dawson, who had not said a single word to Evelyn all day, looked up from his bowl and said, "What's in this?" "Beef, onion, turnip, parsnip, dried thyme, and some things I won't tell you because then you'll try to make it yourself and it won't taste the same and you'll blame me for it." He laughed. It surprised him, the laugh. She could see it on his face. He put his head down and went back to eating. Cole, again at the head of the table, said nothing. But he had a second serving and she noticed it. It was Silas Boone who waited until the table was mostly empty, the other men drifting out to the bunkhouse or back to evening chores, and then sat back in his chair with his coffee and looked at her with the same measuring look he'd had that morning. "You know how to cook," he said. It was stated flatly, as though he were noting a feature of the weather. "I do," she said. "That's not what I have a problem with." "I didn't think it was," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "This is a working ranch. Men need to be able to do their jobs without worrying about things that aren't part of the job." "They'll be able to," she said. "Lucy won't cause problems." Wasn't talking about the girl. He held his coffee mug in both hands. "Women change things, not because they try to, just because they're here. Men start acting different, paying attention to different things. It gets complicated." "Or," Evelyn said, "the food gets better, the kitchen runs better, the supply situation gets better, and the men do their jobs with more energy because they're being fed properly. That's also a possible outcome." Silas looked at her with something that was almost, not quite, but almost respect. "You're not shy about yourself." "I'm not," she agreed. "I'm also not wrong." He set his mug down and stood up. For a moment he just looked at her, the way you'd look at a thing you weren't sure yet what category it belonged in.
Then he picked up his mug and walked out without another word. Evelyn began clearing the table. Hector appeared in the doorway. "I can help with that."
"I've got it," she said, "but you can keep me company if you want." He came in and took a stack of plates without being asked, which she was beginning to understand was how he was. He didn't offer help, he just quietly did it. "Silas always been like that?" she asked. "Most of his life, I expect," Hector said. "He's not mean, I want to say that." Pete said the same thing. "It's true, he's got a way he thinks things should be, and he's been here long enough that he thinks his way and Black Ridge's way are the same thing." Hector stacked the plates carefully. "It's not personal." "It's a little personal," Evelyn said. He considered that. "Maybe a little." She was washing the last of the pots when she heard a small sound from the direction of the storage room and remembered, with a sudden sharp clarity, that she had been so focused on dinner that she had not checked on Lucy in nearly 2 hours. She put down the pot and went to the doorway. Lucy was asleep on the narrow cot Evelyn had set up earlier, still dressed, one boot on and one boot off, a look of complete exhaustion on her small face. On the floor beside the cot was an elaborate arrangement of small stones, bits of twig, and 3 dried beans, some kind of structure, or map, or game that only made sense to a 7-year-old. Evelyn stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she went and took off the remaining boot and pulled the blanket up and stood there a moment longer. The day had been very long. The night would be shorter than she needed. Tomorrow the work would start again, and it would be harder in some ways because the novelty would have worn off, and the men would be measuring her against the memory of yesterday's meals rather than against the low bar of what they'd had before. But they had let her cook. They had eaten what she made. Cole Barrett had come back for seconds, and even Silas Boone had admitted, in his sideways fashion, that she knew what she was doing. 1 week. That was the deal. She went back to the kitchen and picked up the supply ledger from where she'd set it on the corner shelf, and she sat down at the small prep table under the lamp, and she began to go through it again, carefully and from the beginning. She was right about what she'd seen. She was certain of it within 20 minutes. The question of what to do about it was more complicated, and she sat with it for a long time while the kitchen ticked and cooled and the wind moved outside, and Lucy slept in the small room off the back, dreaming whatever a 7-year-old dreamed on the first night in a strange new place that might or might not become home. The supply list came back from town with 2 items crossed off. Evelyn stood in the kitchen doorway holding the revised list and read the notation in Cole Barrett's handwriting, "Not available until spring, substitute as needed," and felt the particular frustration of a person who has already planned around the items in question. Smoked ham hocks and a specific grade of cornmeal. Not catastrophic. She could work around both. But she filed away the information that Cole's system of supply annotation was to cross things off and write substitute as needed without suggesting what the substitution might be, which told her something about how the kitchen had been managed up to now. The cook had been expected to figure it out, or to complain about it, or to quietly not make whatever required the missing ingredient. She would figure it out. She always did. But the casual assumption that figuring it out was someone else's problem, that she would notice. The wagon had returned on a Thursday, 4 days after her arrival. In those 4 days, she had settled into a routine with the particular efficiency of a person who understood that routine was the skeleton of a working kitchen, that without it, everything became improvisation, and improvisation at scale was exhausting and unreliable. 5:30 breakfast, noon sandwich preparation, 6 o'clock dinner, bread baked on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Beans soaked every evening. The stove cleaned every morning before the fire was lit. The larder inventoried every Saturday. She had also, in those 4 days, learned the men. Not all of them, and not deeply. She was not under the illusion that 4 days was enough for that. But she had learned the important things. Who came to the kitchen early because they were genuinely hungry versus who came early because they wanted to talk. Who ate in silence because they were tired versus who ate in silence because something was bothering them. Who took extra portions because they were still growing versus who took extra portions because they hadn't eaten enough the day before and were compensating. These things mattered in a working kitchen. Feeding people wasn't only about the food. It was about knowing who needed what and when and how to provide it without making a production out of it. Pete Callahan was the easy one. He wanted to talk, he was generous with information, and he genuinely liked everyone, including people who didn't particularly deserve it,
which was a rare quality and one she respected even while she understood it would make him an unreliable narrator when it came to assessments of character. Dawson, whose first name she'd learned was Frank, was quieter and more watchful, and he'd nodded at her twice in the past 4 days, with the particular nod that working people used when they wanted to acknowledge competence without making a fuss about it. A young man named Ellis was 19 and homesick, and ate everything she made with an intensity that suggested he was cooking with ingredients from a better table than this one. Silas Boone ate breakfast every morning at the far end of the table and said nothing to her, which she was beginning to understand was not hostility exactly, so much as a sustained withholding of judgment. He watched her. He watched Lucy. He watched how the other men behaved when Evelyn was present, and whether it changed how they worked afterward, and he was gathering data in the same way she was gathering data, which she could respect even while she was aware that his conclusions might differ from hers. Lucy, for her part, had adapted to Black Ridge with a speed that should not have surprised Evelyn, but did anyway. She had found by the second morning a place where she could sit near the window of the storage room and see the corral, and she watched the horses with a focused attention that she normally reserved for things of particular personal significance. By the third day, she had apparently established a relationship of some kind with an elderly brown gelding who came near the corral fence in the mornings, and Evelyn had found her there after breakfast, standing at the fence talking to the horse in the low, confidential tone that children used with animals when they were telling them important things. She had not gotten in anyone's way. She had not been loud or demanding or difficult. She had helped in the kitchen where she could and stayed out of it when she couldn't, and she had constructed in the space behind the storage room where 2 outbuildings made an L-shaped alcove sheltered from the wind, an elaborate landscape out of rocks and sticks and the dried seed pods of last summer's weeds, which Lucy referred to only as the territory, and which she added to and modified each day with the seriousness of a civil engineer. Cole had seen the territory. Evelyn didn't know if he'd seen it because she hadn't been there when it happened, but Hector told her that Cole had stopped by the alcove one afternoon and looked at it for a moment and then walked on without saying anything. Hector seemed to think this was significant. Evelyn reserved judgment. What she had not done in those 4 days was say anything about the supply ledger. It was not that she had changed her mind about what she'd found. She was still certain. She had gone through the ledger 3 more times since that first night, cross-referencing the entries against the current state of the larder and against what she knew from her own experience about the cost of provisions in this part of the country. And the picture that emerged was consistent and, in its consistency, damning. Someone had been recording supply purchases at prices 10 to 30% above what Evelyn estimated the actual cost would be, and the volume of several categories, flour, salt, lard, dried beef, was recorded at quantities that bore no relationship to what was actually in the larder or what could plausibly have been used in the time since the last inventory. The gap between the recorded cost and the likely actual cost, over the period the ledger covered, approximately 14 months, amounted to what she conservatively estimated was several $100s. In a ranch the size of Black Ridge, that was not trivial. What she didn't know yet was who had been responsible for the purchasing. It could have been the previous cook, the one who had quit in September. It could have been someone else entirely. It could, in a scenario she thought was unlikely but couldn't rule out, have been a clerical error of some spectacular consistency. She needed more information before she said anything to Cole Barrett, because the kind of information she was sitting on could cause serious harm if she brought it forward carelessly, and she was not a careless person. So she watched and she waited, and she fed 11 men 3 times a day, and she learned the kitchen and the ranch and the rhythms of both, and she let the week settle around her like weather. The thing that cracked it open was not the ledger at all. It was a barrel of salt. On Friday, the 5th day of her trial week, the supply wagon came back from a second run with a restocked order, and among the delivered items was a 50-pound barrel of coarse salt. Evelyn signed for the delivery from the man who brought it, a weathered individual named Rourke, who drove for the Milner Mercantile in the town of Crail, 12 miles south. She wrote the price in her own running supply log as Rourke stated it, $1.40 for 50 pounds. She put the barrel in the larder and then she opened the main supply ledger to enter it, and she found the most recent entry for salt. 2 months ago, 50 pounds, $2.20. She stood in the larder for a long time. The price of salt did not vary by 80 cents per barrel between September and November. Not in this county. not in any county she had ever worked in. The price of salt was remarkably stable, which was one of the reasons it was useful to her as a benchmark. She'd been using it as a comparison point since the first night she'd looked at the ledger. She went and found Hector. "Who handled the supply ordering before I arrived?" she asked. Hector was mending a piece of harness at the workbench near the tack room. He looked up at her with the careful expression of a man who sensed the direction a conversation might go before being certain he wanted to go there. "Officially, it went through the kitchen. Whoever was cooking put in the order. Rourke delivered. Someone signed for it. And actually, he set the harness down. From about March this year, Denny Walsh started handling the orders. He said the cook at the time, Gould, wasn't keeping the records right. Cole told him to take it over." "Who is Denny Walsh?" "Was," Hector said. "He left in October, 2 weeks after Gould quit." He paused. "He and Cole had a disagreement about something. I don't know what. Cole doesn't share that kind of thing." Evelyn thought about this. She thought about the timing. Walsh leaves in October. Gould leaves in September. The ledger records stopped making sense approximately in March, which was when Walsh took over the ordering. "Does Cole know where Walsh went?" she asked. "Took a job with Harlan Greer's operation, I heard, over near Sentinel Flats." Another pause. "Greer and Cole have had their differences over the years. Land questions mostly. It's not a friendly situation." She thanked him and went back to the kitchen. She pulled the ledger out from the shelf where she'd been keeping it and sat down at the prep table and looked at it for a long time. What she had was suggestive and consistent and probably enough for a reasonable person to act on. What she didn't have was proof of intent. She couldn't prove from a ledger alone that the inflated prices were deliberate rather than some kind of accumulating error. But Walsh's departure, his connection to Greer, the timing, the consistent direction of the discrepancy, it was enough. It was more than enough. If Cole was being defrauded, and if the person responsible had moved directly to a competing operation, then this was not a closed matter. She made her decision. Eating. Cole Barrett's door was open, as it usually was in the afternoon. He was at his desk with the county map spread out in front of him and a cup of cold coffee at his elbow. He looked up when she knocked on the doorframe. "Mrs. Mercer." "I need to show you something," she said. "It's about the supply ledger." Something shifted in his expression. Not alarm, but attention. The particular quality of attention that a person gave when they heard a sentence that told them a larger sentence was coming. "Come in." She sat in the chair across from his desk and put the ledger on the map in front of him. She didn't offer a preamble, because preamble in this kind of conversation was a way of softening something that wasn't going to be soft, regardless of how you approached it. She opened the ledger to the March entries and walked him through it. The salt prices first, because those were clean and unambiguous. Then the flour. Then the lard. She showed him her own running log with the prices Rourke had quoted her, and she showed him the comparison column she'd made. Cole did not say anything while she explained. He listened and he looked at the numbers, and his jaw tightened in a way that she suspected was characteristic of him under pressure. The muscles along his jaw, not angry exactly, but controlled. The kind of control that was covering something. "Over 14 months, she said. "I can't calculate the exact figure without access to your bank records, but based on the quantities and prices in the ledger, I'd estimate you've been overcharged somewhere between $300 and $450. The room was quiet. "Denny Walsh," Cole said. It was not a question. "That would be consistent with what I found." He was quiet again. He closed the ledger and set it to one side and looked at the map for a moment as though it were a different problem he was thinking about. Then he looked at her. "You found this your first night here," he said. "I found it the first night. It took me until today to be certain." "You've been sitting on it for 5 days." "I wanted to be right before I said anything," she said. "I also didn't know the operation well enough on day one to know whether the discrepancies had an innocent explanation. I needed to learn the supply situation first." He was quiet for another moment. She waited. "Walsh came to me in March and said Gould was sloppy with the accounts," Cole said. He was talking in the flat, recounting tone of a man re-examining something he'd believed without examining. Said he'd found several supplier errors that had cost us money, and he wanted to handle the ordering directly going forward. I let him. A beat. He had access to the accounts. Yes. He left 2 weeks after Gould quit. October. Evelyn confirmed. And he went to Harlan Greer's operation, according to Hector. The name landed in the room with a particular weight. Cole looked at her sharply for the first time since she'd started talking. Hector told you about Greer. He mentioned there was a land dispute. Cole stood up from the desk and went to the window and looked out at the yard for a moment. She could see the tension in his back, the set of his shoulders, the way he stood with his weight slightly forward, as though he were bracing against something. Greer's been trying to acquire the eastern section of Black Ridge for 4 years. I've refused every offer. Last spring, he filed a legal challenge on the survey boundary of that section, claimed the original survey was improperly recorded. We've been fighting that in court since April. She absorbed this, and Walsh moved directly from your employ to Greer's. Which I knew, Cole said. He turned from the window. His face was carefully contained, which she was beginning to understand was how he looked when he was genuinely angry. Not loud, not demonstrative, just very still and very controlled. What I didn't know was that he'd spent 6 months stealing from me before he left. I can't prove the intent from the ledger alone, she said, but the pattern is consistent and it's not small enough to be accidental. No, he agreed. It's not. He came back to the desk and sat down. He looked at the ledger, then at her. You've been here 5 days. 6, counting the night of arrival. And you found this. I found it because I reorganized the larder and the numbers didn't match what was there. It wasn't difficult to find if you were paying attention to the inventory. The inventory, Cole said, and there was something in his voice she couldn't quite categorize. Not sarcasm, but something dry and a little bleak. No one was paying attention to the inventory. No, she said. I noticed. He picked up the ledger and held it. Then he set it down again. I'll need to take this to my attorney. He's handling the Greer case. If Walsh is connected to both situations, that's relevant. I thought it might be. Cole looked at her steadily for a moment. She met his gaze and didn't look away, which she'd noticed he paid attention to. He was a man who registered how people responded to his directness, whether they held or deflected. Your trial week ends Sunday, he said. Yes, I'd like to extend it. Not because I'm uncertain about the cooking, that's settled, but because I want to understand the full extent of what Walsh did to the accounts, and you clearly understand the supply records better than I do. I'm a cook, she said, not an accountant. You're also apparently better at reading numbers than anyone else who's been through that kitchen in the past year. He leaned back slightly. I'm not asking you to do my bookkeeping. I'm asking you to stay on, as cook, with your full wages, and to help me understand what I'm looking at if I need a second set of eyes on the supply records. She thought about it for a moment. Not because she was uncertain about the answer, but because she wanted him to know she was making a considered decision rather than just saying yes to the first offer of stability she'd been given in 18 months. All right, she said. He nodded. The room off the kitchen, but you and Lucy can keep it. If you want better accommodations over the winter, we can discuss that. The room is fine, she said. It's warmer than I expected. It backs onto the stove chimney. I know, that's why it's warm. There was a brief pause, and then something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same vicinity. You've checked everything, he said. It's a habit, she said. She picked up her running supply log and stood. One more thing. The second barrel of lard in the larder, the one with the green mark on the lid, the weight is low. Either it was short when it was delivered, or some was removed and not accounted for. I'd check what it was billed at before you close the ledger review. She left him with the ledger and went back to the kitchen. That evening's dinner was pot roast, which she'd started that morning, and the smell had been building in the main house all day with the patience of something that knew it was worth the wait. She served it with roasted root vegetables and the last of the week's bread and a pot of strong coffee that she kept refilled without being asked, because she'd noticed that on cold Friday evenings, the men drank more coffee than usual, and she'd rather anticipate that than run short. The dining room was a different place than it had been 6 days ago. She wasn't sure exactly when the change had happened. It wasn't any single meal, more like a gradual accumulation of evenings where the food was good and the kitchen ran smoothly, and the men stopped tensing slightly when she moved through the room, stopped being vaguely aware of her in the way that people were aware of an element they hadn't decided yet whether to trust. They weren't there yet. She didn't have their full confidence. She knew that. But the room was warmer than it had been. Not the temperature, something else. Pete Callahan was telling a story about a horse he'd known in Texas. A story that was clearly well-traveled and beloved by its repeated embellishments, and Dawson was adding corrections that Pete ignored with the ease of long practice. Ellis was eating with the focused devotion of the young and hungry. 3 other men whose names she'd learned in the past few days were arguing about something to do with fence line that she didn't fully follow. Hector was eating quietly near the door, the way he usually did. Silas Boone was at the end of the table. He had finished eating and was drinking coffee, and he was watching the room with the expression she'd come to think of as his default. Assessing, slightly removed, not unkind but not warm either. He was watching Lucy. Lucy had started coming to the dining room for dinner on the 3rd day, at Evelyn's suggestion, because it was warmer than the kitchen, and because Evelyn had determined, after careful observation, that the men were not going to be made uncomfortable by a 7-year-old eating quietly at the end of the bench. She sat near her mother's end of the room, ate what she was given, and did not speak unless spoken to, which was not Evelyn's rule but Lucy's own apparently self-imposed standard for new environments. When she was comfortable somewhere, she talked constantly. In places where she wasn't sure yet, she watched and waited, which was, Evelyn reflected, probably a trait she'd picked up from watching her mother do it. Tonight Ellis had, apparently feeling bold or perhaps just lonely, asked Lucy what she'd been building in the alcove. Lucy had looked at him for a moment with the measuring look she used on new people. Then she'd said, "It's a ranch, but it's mine." Several men had looked up from their plates. "What kind of ranch?" Ellis asked. "The kind where I decide everything," Lucy said. Pete Callahan had laughed, loud and genuine, and the laugh had traveled around the table like warmth. And even Frank Dawson had smiled in the small, contained way of a man who was careful about how much of himself he showed. Silas Boone had not laughed, but he had looked at the child with an expression that was different from his usual one. Less closed, less appraising. Something more like the look of a person who has heard something unexpected and is sitting with the surprise of it. After dinner, when his room was clearing, Evelyn was gathering serving dishes and she became aware of Silas still in his chair. She didn't address him directly. She'd found that with him, it was better to let him come to whatever he was going to say in his own time rather than prompt it. He said, "The stew last Tuesday. What was the herb in it?" She looked over at him. "Dried thyme and a little dried marjoram. The marjoram's from a tin in the back of the larder. It's old, but it still has something." "My mother used marjoram," he said. She waited. He didn't say anything else. He picked up his mug and stood up and left the room with the deliberate unhurriedness of a man who'd said exactly what he intended to say, no more. Evelyn carried the serving dishes to the kitchen and thought about that. The second week was harder than the first, not because anything went wrong in the kitchen. The kitchen was running better each day, the supply situation was stabilizing, and she'd gotten to the point where she knew the stove's particular preferences well enough to predict where it ran hot and adjust accordingly. The work itself was, in the way that competent work usually was, becoming easier. The harder part was Denny Walsh, or more precisely, what Walsh had left behind. Cole's attorney, a man named Perch, who came out from Crail on Tuesday, spent 3 hours in Cole's office with the supply ledger and the account books, and came out looking the way lawyers looked when they'd found something they'd rather not have found. Evelyn heard most of this secondhand from Hector, who had a way of being present at the edges of significant events that she'd come to think of as a form of loyalty. He stayed close because he wanted to be useful, and being useful required knowing what was happening. According to Hector, Perch believed Walsh's activities might be directly connected to the Greer land case in a way that went beyond coincidence. He'd used a word, orchestrated, that Hector relayed to her with the careful precision of a person who understood the weight of specific words. Cole spent that evening after dinner in his office with the lights burning until nearly midnight. She knew because she was still in the kitchen when he finally came out, and he passed through without seeing her at first, stopped when he registered the lamp was still lit, and came back to the doorway. "You're still up," he said. "I'm doing next week's bread schedule." She looked up at him. He looked tired in the particular way of someone who has been doing difficult thinking for several hours. Not physically tired, but somewhere behind the eyes tired. "Is there coffee? It's probably been sitting too long. I'll drink it anyway. She got him a mug of the old coffee, which was strong and somewhat bitter by this hour, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and drank it without complaint. Walsh was being paid by Greer, he said. Not to her specifically, more the way people sometimes said things that needed to be said aloud before they could be properly put down. Not just after he left, while he was here. Hector mentioned Perch had questions about the connection. Perch has more than questions. He held the mug in both hands, looking at the middle distance. Walsh gave Greer information about the Eastern Boundary Survey. Our copy. Dates, measurements, specific marker locations, information that Greer's legal team used to file the boundary challenge in April. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. And the supply fraud was, what, additional? Supplemental income, Cole said. It came out dry as ash. Taking from me twice, once for Greer, once for himself. I'm sorry, she said. She meant it without qualification. He looked at her then, really looked at her, in a way that was different from the assessing, careful way he usually looked at things. More direct, less filtered. If you hadn't found the ledger, it would have been found eventually, she said. Maybe. Walsh was careful. He might have been careful enough for long enough that it didn't matter when it was found. He drank the rest of the coffee. You found it in one night. I found something suspicious in one night, she said. It took 5 more days to know what I was looking at. He set the mug on the counter. It's going to complicate the legal case. Perch says it could help us. Establishing that Greer was actively trying to undermine the ranch strengthens the argument that the boundary challenge is bad faith. But it's going to take time. He straightened. I may need to go to Crail more often over the next few weeks. I'll need the ranch to run without me. It'll run, she said. He looked at her steadily. I'm starting to believe that. He said goodnight and went to bed, and she sat alone in the kitchen for a while after with the quiet and the lamp and the bread schedule and the knowledge that she had, in a week and a half, become something to this ranch that she hadn't been asked to become. That was how it usually went. You showed up to do one job and ended up doing 3. Not because anyone expected it of you, but because you couldn't look at a problem and walk away from it. That was a quality that had served her well and exhausted her in equal measure for most of her adult life. She finished the bread schedule and banked the fire and went to check on Lucy. Her daughter was asleep, as usual, but tonight she had a small stone on the pillow beside her, one of the rocks from the territory, rounded and pale, that she'd apparently brought in from the alcove. Evelyn moved it gently to the windowsill so it wouldn't be lost in the bedclothes, and stood there a moment in the dark. They were not home yet. She understood that clearly. A week and a half was not home. The room off the kitchen was not home. The trial period being extended was not home. But it was something. It was the tentative beginning of the possibility of home, which was more than they'd had when they climbed on Cutter's wagon, and she held on to that without squeezing it too hard, the way you held a thing that might break if you weren't careful. She went to bed and slept better than she had since they arrived. Look, what she hadn't anticipated was Silas. She'd understood the situation between them as a kind of armed truce. He disliked the change she represented. She accepted that dislike as his prerogative, and they moved around each other with a mutual respect that was cold but functional. She told herself that was enough, that she couldn't win everyone, and the men who mattered, the ones she needed to work alongside every day, were already on side, and Silas was one man with a historical grievance against change in general, and that was a problem she didn't need to solve. She'd misjudged the situation. On the Thursday of her second week, she came around the corner of the main building to find Silas talking to 3 of the younger hands, Ellis among them, in the low, unhurried tone of a man who talked to younger men regularly and knew they were listening. She caught the end of it. Not saying she doesn't know how to cook. She does. But this is a working outfit, and there are things that change when a woman's around. You start thinking about different things. You start acting different. That's not how a ranch runs clean. Ellis saw Evelyn first. His face did a complicated thing, a flash of guilt, then a kind of miserable neutrality. Silas turned and looked at her without particular embarrassment. He was not the kind of man who said things behind people's backs in order to hide them. Mr. Boone, she said. She kept her voice even. If you've got a concern about how I'm affecting this operation, I'd rather you say it to me. I just did, he said. More or less.
More or less isn't the same thing. She came a few steps closer. The three younger men were doing their best to be elsewhere while being physically present. You think my being here changes how the men work? I know it does. I've seen it before. When? He looked at her. He hadn't expected the question. When have you seen it before? She said. Here, specifically. What changed? A pause. It's not about here specifically. Then it's about somewhere else. And you're applying that to me and to this operation based on something that happened somewhere I've never been with people I've never met. Pattern hold, Silas said. But something in his certainty had shifted slightly. Not much, but she could see it. He was a man who was used to his certainties being accepted as conclusions rather than challenged as premises. Maybe it does, she said. And maybe this ranch is running better than it was 3 weeks ago. And your men are eating better and working better because they're not running on short rations and bad food anymore. And maybe that's the pattern you should be looking at. She stopped. She'd said more than she intended, and she could feel the heat of it in her chest. Not anger exactly, but the frustration of being judged by a picture that wasn't her. I'm not asking you to like me, Mr. Boone. I'm asking you to wait until you have a reason to say what you're saying. That's all. She walked past him and into the building. Her hands weren't quite steady when she got back to the kitchen. She stood at the prep table for a moment and breathed and reminded herself that steady hands were a professional requirement and that Silas Boone's opinion of her was not the point. The work was the point. The work was always the point. Lucy came in from the alcove with dirt on her knees and a look of complete preoccupation. I'm expanding the north section, she said. Are you? Evelyn said. It's getting complicated. I need more rocks. She looked at her mother with the acuity children occasionally deployed without warning. Are you mad about something? No, Evelyn said. Then, a little. It's fine. Is it the man with the gray beard? Evelyn looked at her. What do you know about the man with the gray beard? He watches you, Lucy said simply, like he's trying to figure out if you're real or not. She went to the water pail and washed her hands in the competent, utilitarian way of a child who had been washing her own hands since she was 4. I think you'll figure it out eventually. Evelyn didn't say anything for a moment. Go get your rocks, she said finally. Stay out of the north pasture. Lucy went. Evelyn started the dinner prep, and the kitchen filled with the smell of onion in a hot pan, which was one of those smells that was incontrovertibly domestic and good. And she worked in it and let the work do what work did when everything else was uncertain. Give her somewhere to put her hands, give her something to make, give her the clean satisfaction of taking raw materials and producing something better than what she started with. By the time the onions were soft and sweet, and the kitchen was warm and the bread from that morning was cooling on the rack, and the stove was doing what she'd learned to make it do, she had settled back into herself. Not resolved. Silas wasn't resolved, and she didn't pretend he was. But she had said what she needed to say to him, and she had come back to the kitchen, and the kitchen was hers now in the way that a space became yours after you'd worked in it long enough. Not ownership, but belonging, which was a different thing and in some ways a more durable one. She was here. She was working. She was staying. That was enough for today. The first snow came on a Monday, which Evelyn noted with the pragmatic attention she gave to all things that affected the kitchen's operation. It was not the serious snow. Not yet. 3 inches overnight, gone from the yard by noon where the sun hit it, lingering in the shadows of the outbuildings and along the north fence line where the wind had pushed it into low ridges. The men went out in it without particular complaint, pulling their collars up and their hats down, and came back at noon with red faces and the particular appetite that cold work produced, which was different from warm weather hunger in a way she'd learned to anticipate and plan for. She made a double quantity of the bean soup that day, and there was none left. What it meant, the snow, was that the supply window was narrowing. She'd known this theoretically since her first day, when Cole had told her the roads could go bad in 2 or 3 weeks. Now she could see it happening in the way the temperature dropped each evening and didn't fully recover during the day, and the way the sky had a particular flat gray quality that people who had spent winters on the high plains learned to read like text. She had spent enough winters in enough places to read it. Another week, maybe 10 days, and Rourke's wagon would stop coming reliably. She'd made her final major supply order the previous Thursday. She'd gone over it 3 times before giving it to Cole,
Not because she doubted her calculations, but because the consequences of getting it wrong were serious, and she preferred to check her work. Cole had looked at the list and then at her and said, "This is more than we usually order for winter." "I know," she said. "The usual winter order assumed a cook who would do less with what he had. I'm going to do more." He'd sent the order. Now she was tracking the deliveries as they came in, checking each item against the order and against the revised ledger she'd been maintaining since she found the discrepancies in the old one. Everything was coming in at the prices Rourke quoted. She checked those numbers with the particular attention of someone who understood that the checks were necessary not because she distrusted Rourke, but because systems failed when nobody was watching them, and she intended to be someone who watched. The ranch had settled into a winter rhythm that was different from the autumn one. The days were shorter and the work shifted accordingly. Less time in the far pastures, more time close to the buildings, maintenance and repair work that the busy seasons didn't allow. Fence posts, tack, equipment. The men were around more, which meant the kitchen was used differently. There was more coffee consumed in the mornings, more time at the table after meals, more of the particular restless energy of working men who were not working at full capacity and weren't entirely comfortable with it. Lucy had adapted the territory to winter. She'd built a small wooden structure over part of it, a lean-to made of 3 sticks and a piece of canvas scrap she'd found somewhere. And she conducted the life of her imaginary ranch from under this canopy with impervious concentration regardless of the temperature. She wore her heaviest coat and her wool hat with the ear flaps, and she worked with the focused gravity of a 7-year-old engaged in something she considered completely serious. Ellis had started checking on the territory occasionally in a casual way that clearly wasn't casual at all. He would drift past on some other pretext and slow down and look, and sometimes Lucy would explain something to him about the current state of affairs in the territory, and he would listen with the careful attention of a young man trying to be worthy of the confidence of a child who didn't give it easily. Evelyn watched this from the kitchen window and found it harder to look at than she expected, not because it was bad, but because it was good in a way that pressed against something tender in her chest. The fact that Lucy was making a place for herself here, that she was beginning to trust these people and this ground. It mattered more than she let herself think about too directly. She was still keeping a part of herself provisional about Black Ridge. Not because she didn't want to trust it, but because trusting a place before you'd earned the right to it had a way of making the leaving, if it came to that, worse than it needed to be. She had been at Black Ridge for 4 weeks when Cole came to the kitchen on a Tuesday evening with a look she hadn't seen on him before. Not the controlled containment of his usual concern, but something sharper and more unsettled. "I have to go to Crail," he said. "Day after tomorrow. Perch needs me there for a hearing. Greer's legal team has filed a new motion, and the judge wants both parties present." He set his hat on the counter, a gesture that meant he intended to talk for more than 30 seconds. "I don't know how long it will take. Could be 2 days, could be a week, depending on how the judge rules on the motion." "All right," Evelyn said. The ranch?" "Will run," she said. "What does the crew need from me while you're gone?" He looked at her for a moment. She'd noticed he did this, paused before answering, not because he was slow, but because he was the kind of person who didn't like to speak before he knew what he meant to say. "The north pasture fence has 2 sections that need replacing before the heavy snow comes. Frank Dawson is going to manage that. There's a shipment of hay coming from Terrell's operation on Friday if the roads hold. Pete knows to receive it. The horses need their winter shoes. Hector can do most of them, but the 2 yearlings will need the farrier, and he's coming Saturday. I'll make sure everyone's fed and the house is running," she said. "Anything else I should know about?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Greer's motion. Perch says it's an attempt to invalidate the original land survey entirely. Not just challenge the boundary, invalidate the survey on the grounds that the surveyor who conducted it wasn't properly licensed at the time." He said this in the flat tone he used when the content of a sentence was something he found genuinely difficult. If they succeed, the eastern section's legal status becomes a question. It's not a simple question. Is that likely? That they'd succeed? Perch says probably not. But Greer has money and Greer is patient, and probably not isn't the same as no. She understood that. "When do you leave?" "Thursday morning, first light." She nodded. "I'll have food packed for the road." He picked up his hat. He stood there for a moment, which wasn't entirely like him. Cole Barrett was not a man who lingered in doorways. He had something else to say and was deciding whether to say it. If anything comes up while I'm gone, he said. Anything you can't handle, I'll handle it, she said. He looked at her. Not the assessing look, something different. Something that was, she thought, the early, unfinished form of reliance. I know, he said, and went out. He left Thursday morning before the sky was fully light, with a packed saddlebag and the leather case that contained the ranch's legal documents. Evelyn had been up since 3:30, and she put food in his hands before he mounted up. Bread wrapped in cloth, cold meat, dried apples, a small tin of coffee. And he took it without comment, which meant he'd expected it. And that meant something, though she didn't examine what. She stood in the yard until the sound of hooves was gone, then went back inside. The day was normal. The next day was normal. The day after that, Saturday, the day the farrier was supposed to come, the sky changed. She noticed it at noon, the quality of the light. She'd been outside checking on the hay delivery, which had arrived Friday afternoon as promised, and she looked up and the sky had that particular color that she associated with the worst kind of winter weather. Not gray, but a sort of yellowish gray, like old pewter, low and flat, and completely still. The wind had died. That was the part that worried her. The wind on the high plains never fully died. When it did, it was because something was coming that would bring its own wind. She went to find Frank Dawson. He was in the tack room with 2 other men, working on a saddle that needed resoling. He looked up when she came in, and she saw immediately that he'd seen the sky too. How bad, she said. Dawson considered this in the careful way of a man who understood the difference between accurate and alarmist. Bad enough. It's got the feel of a real one, not just snow. Tonight? Tonight, tomorrow morning at the latest. She thought through what needed to happen. The hay is in the barn. That's good. The horses that are in the far pasture need to come in, the yearlings especially. I was going to send Ellis and Tom out this afternoon. Send them now, she said. Don't wait for afternoon. He looked at her for a moment, not resistant, just registering that she'd given him a directive, and then nodded. Yeah, you're right. He put down the saddle piece and stood up. Tom, Ellis, get your coats. She went back to the kitchen and started thinking about what the next 24 to 48 hours would require. Hot food that could be kept hot and reheated, enough coffee that it would never run out. If men were coming in from outside work at irregular intervals, she needed something that would be ready whenever it was needed, not something that required precise timing. She put a pot of soup on and began building it in the slow, layered way of something meant to cook all day. She brought in extra wood from the pile and stacked it beside the stove. She checked the water supply and found it adequate. She checked the lamp oil and found it adequate. She found, in the back of the larder, a tin of hard peppermint candies that she'd bought in the last supply order and put them in her apron pocket because she'd learned that small comforts mattered more during hard weather than most people thought they did when planning for hard weather. Lucy came in from the alcove, windblown and pink-cheeked, carrying 3 rocks. Come inside, Evelyn said. Stay inside today. Lucy looked at the sky without being told why and made her own assessment. Is it going to snow a lot? Yes. Will the horses be okay? The men are bringing them in. The brown one, the old one near the fence. He'll be in the barn, Evelyn said. Come inside, Lucy. The storm came faster than Dawson had estimated. By 4 in the afternoon, the snow had started. Not gentle, not tentative, but committed. The kind of snow that came sideways and meant it. The wind came with it, as she'd anticipated, and within an hour the visibility in the yard had dropped to the length of the building. She could hear it against the kitchen walls, a sustained hissing pressure that she knew from experience was going to get worse before it got better. The men came in from their work in stages, shaking snow from their coats in the entryway, their faces scraped red by the wind. She had coffee ready. She had the soup ready. She fed them as they came, in whatever order they arrived, without waiting for a formal meal time. This was not how the kitchen usually operated, but this was not a usual evening. Ellis came in at 5, which was later than the others, and he was alone. Where's Tom? Dawson asked. Ellis was getting snow off his coat, his back to the room. Tom's coming. He went back for the gray mare. She got loose from the line when the wind picked up. He said he'd be right behind me. Dawson was quiet for a moment. How long ago? Ellis turned around. The look on his face was the particular look of a young man who had just realized something was wrong. 20 minutes, maybe.
"In this visibility," Dawson said, and he was already moving. Evelyn understood immediately. 20 minutes in this storm, alone, with a loose horse, that was not fine. The distance between fine and not fine in a blizzard could be 50 feet in 2 minutes. She didn't say anything, but she took 2 lanterns from the hook above the door and lit them without being asked and handed them to Dawson as he pulled his coat back on. "I'll go with you," Pete said. "No," Dawson said. "Stay here. If we both go and something happens, there's nobody left who knows the ground." He took the lanterns. "Which direction was the gray last?" "North side of the barn," Ellis said. His voice had gone a little tight. Dawson went out. The kitchen was very quiet for about 3 minutes. Then Evelyn said, "Ellis, sit down and eat something." I should have waited for him. "Sit down," she said, not unkindly, but firmly, the way you talk to someone who is about to do something useless out of guilt. Frank Dawson has been working this ranch for 6 years, and he knows every foot of that yard in the dark. You going back out and getting lost also doesn't help Tom. Sit down. He sat. He didn't eat, but he sat, which was the point. The wait was 11 minutes, which felt considerably longer. Then the exterior door opened and Dawson came in with Tom behind him. Tom, who had a cut above his left eye from where he'd gone down on the ice, and a gray mare's lead line in his left hand, and his right arm held against his body in a way that Evelyn recognized immediately. "Let me see the arm," she said. "It's fine," Tom said. "It's not fine. Let me see it." He was 23, Tom Greer, and he had the stoic stubbornness of a young man who associated injury with weakness in a way that age would eventually correct, but hadn't yet. He let her look at the arm with the expression of someone submitting to an indignity. The shoulder was wrong, not the bone, she thought. She pressed carefully along the joint, and he didn't make a sound, but his breathing changed, which told her where the pain was. But the shoulder was displaced. She'd seen this before. A fall, the arm out to catch yourself, the joint taking the impact at the wrong angle. "Your shoulder is out," she said. "It needs to go back." He went slightly pale. "Can you do that?" She looked at him steadily. "I've done it twice. Once on my husband and once on a hotel kitchen worker who fell off a loading platform. It hurts considerably. It takes about 10 seconds, and after it's done, you'll feel better than you do now." Tom looked at Dawson, which Evelyn didn't take personally. Men in pain often looked for permission from other men. Dawson looked at her, and the look said, "I believe her," and Tom said, "All right." It was not a pleasant 10 seconds for anyone in the room. When it was over, Tom was white-faced and sweating and breathing hard, but the shoulder was back where it belonged, and the quality of his pain had changed. She could see it in his face, the shift from the grinding wrongness of a displaced joint to something sharper and cleaner, and already beginning to ease. She made him sit and gave him coffee and bound the shoulder tightly with strips of cloth to keep it from moving and told him he was to use that arm for nothing heavier than a coffee mug for 2 weeks. "I've got work," he started. 2 weeks, she said, "or it goes out again and the next time is worse." He didn't argue further. Dawson looked at her across the kitchen, and there was something in his face that hadn't been there before. A settled recognition, the look of a person who has revised a judgment upward. He didn't say anything. He went and got coffee and sat down at the prep table, and after a moment he said, "Storm's not letting up. Could be here through tomorrow night." "I know," she said. "We've got enough food and wood. We'll be fine. Cole's not going to be able to get back from Crail in this." "No," she said. "He isn't." She had known this since 4 o'clock, when she'd looked at the sky and understood what was coming. Cole was stuck in Crail for the duration of the storm, which meant Blackridge was running without him for however long the storm lasted, and whatever happened here was on her and Dawson and the men. She took stock. All 11 hands were present and accounted for, plus Hector. The horses were in the barn. The hay was in. The wood supply was sufficient. Tom's shoulder was addressed. The food situation was managed. They were going to be cold and stuck and a little stir-crazy by tomorrow evening, but none of that was life-threatening. She went back to the stove and stirred the soup. The night was noisy in the way of serious winter storms, the wind finding every gap in the building's joints, a sustained complaint that you stopped hearing after a while the way you stopped hearing a river if you lived beside one. The men played cards at the dining room table and drank coffee and argued about nothing in particular, which was healthy.
Ellis looked in on Tom every hour with the guilt-driven diligence of a young man who still hadn't forgiven himself. And Tom, who was feeling better once the shoulder was resting, told him to stop hovering, which was also healthy. Silas Boone was quiet all evening, which was not unusual, but he helped carry the extra wood without being asked, and he made sure Tom's coffee was refilled when it ran low. And when Pete Callahan's card game got loud enough to disturb Tom's rest, it was Silas who told Pete, quietly and without fuss, to take it to the bunkhouse. Evelyn noticed all of this. She didn't comment on it. At 9:30, Hector came into the kitchen with a look she'd learned to pay attention to. Not alarmed, but carrying information that he hadn't decided how to deliver. "Ryder came in," he said. "Just now from the North Road. Nearly got himself killed getting through." She turned from the stove. "Who?" "Messenger from Perch's office. He's in bad shape from the cold. I've got him in the front room." Hector paused. "He's got a letter for you." "For me?" "Addressed to you. Cole sent it through Perch's office. Perch has a boy who rides fast when he needs to. Or did. Boy's gonna need warming up." He held out the letter. She wiped her hands and took it. The handwriting on the outside was Cole's. She'd seen enough of his notes to know it, compact and slightly angular. She broke the seal and read it standing at the stove. It was not long. Cole was not a man who used more words than necessary, and in this letter he used very few. He had sent it before the storm arrived, when he thought the messenger could get through with news of the hearing, Greer's motion presented today. Judge recessed to consider. Perch believes ruling will come Thursday. The question turned on the original survey documentation. Greer's attorneys argue the original surveyor, a man named Aldous Hart, was not licensed by the territory at the time he conducted the Black Ridge Survey in 1871. If they can establish this, the survey has no legal standing. Perch has located a copy of a letter from the Territorial Surveyor's Office that may establish Hart was provisionally licensed. But Greer's attorney has a witness, a former clerk from the licensing office, who says no provisional license was issued. Perch needs the original survey document itself, specifically the surveyor's seal and the certification mark on the bottom right corner. Hector knows where the ranch's copy of the survey is kept. If the seal includes the certification notation P, TLC, Provisional Territorial License, that notates an additional register, Perch says if that notation exists, there may be another witness who can speak to it. An old survey assistant named Caleb Morrow, who worked with Hart in 1871 and would have been present at the survey of the eastern section. Last known location, Perch believes, was a settlement called Drover's Rest, about 18 miles northeast of Black Ridge. "I cannot reach Morrow from Crail in this weather. I will not be able to return before the hearing date. I'm sorry to put this on paper and send it into a blizzard, but I have no other choice. If there is any way to get word tomorrow before Thursday morning, it may save everything. If not, Perch will do what he can with what he has. C. Barrett." Evelyn read the letter twice. Then she set it on the counter and looked at the clock. It was 9:42 in the evening. Thursday morning. The hearing was Thursday morning, which was, she counted, today being Sunday, 3 days away. 3 days, with a blizzard running, and a witness 18 miles northeast in a settlement she'd never heard of, with no way to know if the man was still there or in any condition to travel or willing to be found. She found Hector in the front room helping the messenger, a young man named Graves who was about 20 and currently the color of old chalk, with dry clothes and a blanket. "Hector," she said, "the survey document, where is it?" "Bottom drawer of the filing cabinet in Cole's office, left side." "I need to see it, the seal specifically." He looked at her for a moment. Then he got up and went to the office and came back with a folded document in a protective leather sleeve. She opened it on the dining room table, spreading it carefully. The survey document was 16 years old. The paper had the brittle quality of things that had been folded and unfolded many times and then left alone for years. She found the surveyor's seal at the bottom right corner. The seal read, A.D. Hart, Survey, Black Ridge Eastern Sector, 1871, PTL, Reference 7. She stared at that notation for a long time. PTL, Reference 7. Reference 7 meant it was the 7th entry in whatever provisional register existed, which meant there was a register. Which meant if it still existed, Greer's witness could be contradicted directly. And if Caleb Morrow had been present at this survey in 1871, He would know about the seal, about the license, about everything Greer's attorneys were trying to erase. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the window, looking at the snow that was still driving sideways across the yard. 18 miles northeast, in a blizzard, on roads that might or might not be passable, to find a man who might or might not be where they thought, who might or might not be willing to travel back with a stranger to testify in a legal hearing in 3 days. Dawson was in the kitchen doorway. He'd been watching her. "You going to tell me what's in the letter?" he said. She told him. She told him concisely, the way Cole had written it, just the essential information, without framing it in a way that asked him to make a decision he hadn't been asked to make yet. When she was done, Dawson was quiet for a long moment. 18 miles northeast in this, he said. Yes. Roads will be rough tomorrow. Depending on how the storm moves, it might ease by morning. It might, she agreed. He was quiet again. You're not thinking of going yourself. I'm thinking about all the options, she said. The option that involves you riding 18 miles in a blizzard is not... I said I'm thinking about all of them. She turned from the window. Who knows the Northeast Road best? Pete rode it in September, coming from that direction. He paused. I know it better than he does. I went up to Drover's Rest in August for a horse trade. You know where the settlement is? I know where it was in August. She held his gaze. If the storm eases by morning, would you go? He looked at her for a long time. Frank Dawson was not a man who made promises lightly, and she could see him doing exactly what she would have done, running the math of risk and likelihood and weighing it against what was at stake. If it eases enough to ride safely, he said. Yes, I'll write the message tonight, she said. Everything Morrow needs to know, everything Perch needs him to bring. If he's there and he's willing, he'll have it all in writing. And if he's not willing, then we've tried, she said. But I think he will be. A man who spent time doing survey work with Aldous Hart in 1871, that's not nothing to him. That's his work, his record. Greer's attorney is trying to say that work didn't count. I don't think a man who did that work is going to hear that and shrug. Dawson thought about that. No, he said. Probably not. She sat down at the prep table with a sheet of paper and a pen and began to write. She wrote carefully, in the clear, ordered way she organized everything. The legal situation first, plainly stated, without dramatizing it. Then the specific questions about the survey, the license notation, the register reference, then the hearing date and the location and what Morrow would need to bring. Then a single paragraph at the end that was not the legal argument but the human one, that a ranch built on 16 years of work was being threatened by a falsified account of its origins, and that the man who built it was sitting in a courthouse 2 days' ride away, unable to get back through the snow, and that the one person who could correct the record with first-hand knowledge was Caleb Morrow. She didn't ask Morrow to be heroic. She didn't frame it as a great act. She just told him what was true, directly, and let it sit on the page and speak for itself. She folded the letter and sealed it. The storm pressed against the kitchen windows. Tom was asleep in the bunkhouse with his shoulder bound and probably feeling the beginning of the deep ache that came after a dislocation was corrected, when the shock wore off and the insult to the joint made itself fully known. The messenger named Graves was warming up in the front room and would sleep there tonight on the settee. The horses were in the barn, the men were in the bunkhouse or the house. The soup was on the stove at low heat and would be there in the morning. She had done what she could do tonight. She went to check on Lucy, who was asleep as always, undisturbed by the storm, in the complete way of children who trusted that adults were handling it. The pale stone from the territory was still on the windowsill where Evelyn had moved it weeks ago. The territory itself was under 6 inches of snow tonight, probably more, and the lean-to may or may not have survived the wind. Lucy would assess this in the morning with the equanimity she brought to most things. Evelyn stood in the doorway and listened to her daughter breathe and listened to the storm and thought about Cole Barrett in a courthouse in Crail, waiting for a ruling that might undo 16 years of work, not knowing whether a message had gotten through, not knowing whether the snow had buried everything. She would tell him when he got back that the ranch had run fine. That would be true. It was running fine. She was making sure of it, the same way she made sure the stove was clean and the biscuits were right and the numbers in the ledger matched what was in the larder. Because those things mattered, because someone had to pay attention. And she was someone who paid attention. What she wouldn't tell him, What she would never particularly think to tell him, because it wasn't the kind of thing she noted about herself, was that the ranch was running fine because she had decided it would. That the decision had been made before the storm started, before the letter arrived, before Tom's shoulder went out and the messenger nearly froze himself to get through. That the decision to be the person who handled things was not a calculation she'd made at Black Ridge, but a condition she'd carried so long she'd stopped thinking of it as a decision at all. She went to bed. The storm ran all night and into Monday, and eased toward Monday afternoon into something that was still cold and still blowing, but no longer trying to erase the world. On Monday evening, she looked at the sky, and it had changed again. The yellowish gray was gone, replaced by clear, cold dark, and the stars were very bright the way they were when the air had been scoured clean. She found Dawson after dinner. "It's easing," she said. "I saw," he said. "If you leave at first light, you'd have time." He looked at the cleared sky through the window. "Roads are going to be rough." "Yes." "Could still be drifted in sections." "Yes." "It's still a long shot," he said. "Most things worth doing are," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and there was something in his face that she couldn't entirely read. It wasn't reluctance, and it wasn't enthusiasm either. It was the look of a man who had understood something about the nature of his work that he hadn't articulated before. That the work wasn't only horses and fences. That it was this, too. That when you stayed somewhere long enough and a place became yours and the way places became yours, not by title, but by daily investment, by giving a damn, by showing up every morning and doing the thing, then the thing that threatened it was yours to fight too. "I'll be ready at first light," he said. She gave him the letter. She also gave him a wrapped package of food for the road. Bread, meat, the last of the hard cheese, 2 of the peppermint candies from her pocket, and he took it without comment, which had become their way of doing things, the two of them. She anticipated what was needed, he accepted it without making a fuss about it, and the ranch kept running. She watched him go out to check his horse for the morning ride, and she stood in the kitchen doorway a moment longer than necessary, her arms crossed against the cold that came in through the gap. Behind her, the stove ticked and settled. The soup pot was clean. The bread for tomorrow was rising under a cloth on the counter. The kitchen was what it was every evening, ordered, warm, ready. She closed the door and went back to work. Dawson left before sunrise. Evelyn heard him in the yard at first light. The sound of hooves on frozen ground, the particular creak of saddle leather and cold air. And she was already at the stove when he came to the kitchen door to pick up the food she'd packed. She handed it to him through the doorway without ceremony. He took it and looked at her for a moment, his breath making clouds in the cold. "Roads might be drifted north of the ridge," he said. "I know." "If they're impassable, use your judgment," she said. "You know the ground better than I do." He nodded, put the package in his saddlebag, and rode out. She stood in the doorway until the sound of his horse was gone, then closed the door against the cold and went back to the stove. The sky outside was the particular clear dark blue of very early morning after a hard storm, the kind of sky that looked clean and simple and gave no indication that getting anywhere in it would be difficult. She knew better. The beauty of the post-storm sky was not a promise about the roads. She did not allow herself to think too much about Dawson's chances. She had thought about them the previous night, carefully and without sentimentality, and she had concluded that the chances were real enough to justify sending him, and not so certain that she should count on anything. That was the honest assessment. She had made it and acted on it, and now the acting on it was out of her hands, which was a condition she'd made her peace with a long time ago. You did what you could do, and you let the rest be what it was. What she could do this morning was feed 11 men and keep the ranch running, so she did that. Tuesday passed without word from Dawson or from Crail. This was not surprising. There was no mechanism by which word would arrive quickly, and she hadn't expected it. But the absence of information had a weight to it that she felt in the back of her mind all day, a low, persistent awareness that things were in motion that she couldn't see or influence. She had learned over the years to work alongside that awareness without letting it take up more space than it was entitled to. It didn't always work. That day it mostly worked. The men were restless in the particular cabin fever way of people who had been kept close by weather and were now technically free to work, but not yet fully reoriented to the rhythms of outdoor labor. There were small frictions, a dispute between 2 men about whose responsibility it was to clear the barn entrance, a missing tool that turned out to have been borrowed and not returned, the ordinary friction of people spending too much time in close quarters. Evelyn fed them well and kept the kitchen warm and stayed out of the disputes, which were not hers to solve and which would resolve themselves, as these things usually did, through the ordinary abrasion of daily work. Tom's shoulder was improving. He came to breakfast Tuesday with his arm in the cloth sling she'd made and ate left-handed with the concentrated effort of someone adapting to a limitation, and he didn't complain, which she respected. Ellis checked on him twice, which Tom continued to find irritating and which Evelyn found quietly moving. The way young men expressed guilt and care through the medium of practical attention, as though checking on someone often enough would retroactively undo whatever they felt responsible for. Lucy, for her part, spent most of Tuesday excavating the territory from its snow cover with a dedication that Evelyn found both admirable and slightly alarming. The lean-to had partially collapsed, which Lucy reported to Evelyn in the evening with the equanimity of a person who had already decided to rebuild it better. "The whole north section is under snow," Lucy said. "It will melt," Evelyn said. "The horses probably moved some of the boundary rocks." "Probably." Lucy considered this. "I might change where the north fence goes anyway. I was thinking about it during the storm. It might be better further east." "That sounds like a good use of the setback," Evelyn said. Lucy looked at her with the particular look she used when she was trying to determine whether she was being taken seriously or managed. She appeared to conclude it was the former and went back to her soup. Wednesday morning, still nothing from Crail. The hearing was Thursday. Dawson had left Monday at first light. 18 miles northeast in post-blizzard conditions, she'd been calculating and recalculating. If the roads were passable, he could reach Drover's Rest in 4 to 5 hours. If Morrow was there and cooperative, they could be back by nightfall. If Morrow could travel to Crail, they'd need to leave immediately and ride through Wednesday, which was possible but hard. If any one of those conditions failed, she stopped calculating. It didn't help. She went to make bread. She was pulling the second batch from the oven on Wednesday afternoon when she heard a horse in the yard. She set the bread pan on the rack and went to the window and looked out. It was not Dawson. It was a horse she didn't recognize, a dun with road-worn flanks, and the man riding it was not anyone from the ranch. He was heavy-set, riding with the settled posture of someone who had been in a saddle a long time, and he was coming to the main house with the directness of someone who knew exactly where he was going. She went to the front door and opened it before he got down. "Can I help you?" she said. He looked at her. He was somewhere around 50, with a short gray beard and eyes that had a lawyerly quality. The kind of eyes that were always reading the situation in front of them and deciding how much to reveal. "I'm looking for Cole Barrett." "He's in Crail. I'm Evelyn Mercer. I manage the house and kitchen." Mercer. He seemed to run the name through some catalog. "He mentioned you, actually. I'm Alan Perch. I'm Cole's attorney." She stepped back from the door. "Come in." He came in and she took his coat and brought him to the kitchen, which was warm and smelled of fresh bread, and he sat at the prep table and accepted coffee with the grateful seriousness of a man who had been riding in cold weather for several hours. "I came ahead of Cole," Perch said. "He'll be back tomorrow or the day after, depending on roads." He wrapped his hands around the coffee mug. "The hearing was this morning." She went still. "And?" Perch looked at her with an expression that was doing several things at once. Professional containment, genuine feeling underneath it, and something that looked a lot like tired relief. "Your man Dawson arrived in Crail last night, with Caleb Morrow." She let out a slow breath. "Morrow is 81 years old," Perch said. "He's hard of hearing, he walks with 2 canes, and he spent last night in Crail in a boarding house bed that he said was the worst he'd slept on since 1869. He also walked into that courtroom this morning with the original field notes from the 1871 Black Ridge Survey in a leather case he's apparently been carrying for 16 years. And he stood in front of the judge and the opposing counsel and told them, in quite considerable detail, exactly what Provisional Territorial License Number 7 was, who issued it, what it covered, and why Aldous Hart's survey of the eastern section of Black Ridge was not only legally valid, but was, in his professional assessment, one of the most meticulously conducted surveys he had participated in during 40 years of fieldwork. The kitchen was very quiet. "Greer's witness," Evelyn said, "the former clerk." Perch's expression cooled considerably. Morrow knew him. They'd worked in the same office, briefly, in the early 70s. He was able to speak to the man's reliability with, let's call it, specificity. He paused. The judge ruled in Barrett's favor on all points. Greer's motion was denied. The boundary stands. She sat down. She hadn't planned to sit, but her legs made the decision without consulting her, which she found mildly embarrassing and was also willing to accept. Morrow made it in time, she said. She was stating it as much for herself as for Perch, organizing it into something real, something that had actually happened. He did. Perch studied her. That letter you wrote? Morrow showed it to me. He said it was the clearest summary of a legal situation he'd been handed by a non-attorney, and he's been in and out of courts for 40 years. He took a drink of his coffee. He also said he'd have come anyway, once he understood what was at stake, but that the letter made him understand it in about 4 minutes, which is why he agreed to leave at first light Wednesday, rather than waiting until he felt more like traveling. He didn't need to be persuaded, Evelyn said. He needed to understand the situation. There's a difference, Perch agreed. Most people can't see it. You apparently can. She looked at her hands for a moment, flat on the prep table. Then she got up and checked the bread, which needed to come off the cooling rack, and gave herself something to do with her hands. Cole, she said. He knows the ruling? He was in the courtroom. He was there when Morrow walked in. Perch paused, and something in his professional expression bent slightly toward something more personal. I've been Barrett's attorney for 6 years. I've seen him in court before. When Morrow came through that door with those field notes, I saw something on Cole Barrett's face that I hadn't seen before. He stopped there, which was the right place to stop. She didn't ask what it was. She thought she knew. He'll want to thank you, Perch said. He doesn't have to, she said. He will anyway. Cole came back on Friday. She heard the horse before she saw him. She was in the kitchen, and she heard it, a single horse coming into the yard at a pace that was faster than the road probably warranted, and she knew before she looked out the window that it was him. She knew the sound his horse made, which she noted as information and tried not to assign too much meaning to. He came in through the front door and she heard him in the hall, and then he was in the kitchen doorway. He looked tired, the specific tired of someone who had been running hard on not enough sleep for too many days and hadn't quite metabolized the fact that it was over. His coat had road dust on it and his jaw was dark with several days of stubble, and he had the general quality of a man who needed a meal and about 12 hours of sleep, in that order. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. There's soup, she said. Sit down. He sat. She put a bowl in front of him and poured coffee, and he ate without speaking for several minutes, and she let him because he needed food more than he needed conversation, and because she had learned that Cole Barrett was a person who processed things internally before he spoke about them, and that pushing against that was pointless. Finally, he said, Dawson told me about the storm, Tom's shoulder. Tom's recovering well. He's been using the sling. And the horses. All in, all fine. Dawson handled it. I just made sure the lanterns were lit and pointed him in the right direction. Cole looked at his soup. Perch told me about the letter you wrote tomorrow. Perch got here Wednesday. I know, he told me. A pause. He said you wrote the letter Sunday night after the messenger came through. It was the obvious thing to do. It was, Cole said, and his voice had something in it she hadn't quite heard there before. Not quite emotion, not quite its absence, but something sitting carefully between the two. It was also a long shot, and you took it anyway, and it worked. Dawson took it, she said. He's the one who rode 18 miles in bad roads. Dawson went because you asked him to and gave him a reason that made sense. He set down his spoon and looked at her directly. I've been trying to figure out, writing back, how to say thank you in a way that means what I intend it to mean. I haven't come up with anything that isn't insufficient. She held his gaze. The ranch is intact. That's the point. Yes, he said. Because of you. Because of Morrow and Dawson and the fact that you had an honest survey done in 1871 by a man who kept his field notes for 16 years. She paused. I just connected the pieces. You found the ledger. You found the fraud. You ran the ranch through a blizzard. You figured out what the case needed and got it there. He was not saying this with emotion. He was saying it the way he said most things, direct and without ornamentation, which made it harder to deflect. Those aren't small things, Mrs. Mercer. Evelyn, she said, It came out without particular decision. I think we're past Mrs. Mercer. Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatic, not a transformation. A small, careful loosening of the set that his face usually held. Evelyn, he said. All right. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Eat your soup, she said. It's been on since this morning, and it's not going to improve by sitting. He ate his soup. Tut-tut. The week after Cole's return was different from the weeks before the storm, though Evelyn would have struggled to say exactly how. The work was the same. The cooking, the kitchen management, the supply tracking. Cole's days were the same. Early mornings, long hours outside, evenings in the office with purchase paperwork, and the follow-up documentation from the hearing. The men were the same men. The routine was the same routine. But something had settled. That was the closest she could come to describing it. Like a building after a foundation has been tested by something serious and held. The building doesn't change, but the people in it move through it differently, with a quality of ease that comes from knowing the ground under them has been tested. Perch visited twice more in the 2 weeks after the ruling, tying off the legal loose ends. He also brought, on his second visit, documentation relating to Denny Walsh. The county sheriff had been contacted about the fraud evidence, and Walsh's current whereabouts had been established. Whether he'd face legal consequences was a question that would take more time to answer than the land case, Perch said. The evidence was solid. The process was slow. These were distinct facts that did not cancel each other out. Harlan Greer made no further moves, which Perch said was consistent with the pattern of a man who chose his battles on the basis of likelihood of success and had, for the moment, recalculated. For the moment, Cole said when Perch told him this. Likely longer than that, Perch said. But it's Greer. I wouldn't assume permanently. I never assumed permanently, Cole said. Cole time. Tom Greer's shoulder healed on schedule. He was back to full work by the end of the second week, and he came to the kitchen one evening and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said, I wanted to say thank you for the shoulder. It wasn't complicated, Evelyn said. It was for me, he said. He put his hat back on and left. She thought about that for a while after he was gone. It was Hector who told her, on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after Cole's return, that there had been a letter. He came to the kitchen with it in his hand and set it on the counter beside her without particular ceremony, which was not how he usually handled mail. Usually he left correspondence on Cole's desk. She looked at the letter. The return name on the envelope was Mercer, but not her handwriting. A different Mercer. She looked at Hector. It came yesterday, he said. Cole saw it on the hall table and asked me to bring it to you. She picked it up. The handwriting was formal, careful, the penmanship of someone who had learned to write with the intention of impressing. She knew before she opened it what it was. She had known, in the back of her mind, that it was coming. She'd been waiting for it, with the particular resigned attention she gave to things she couldn't stop but could prepare for. She opened it. It was from Gerald Mercer, her late husband's older brother. Gerald, who lived in Topeka with his wife Constance and their 3 children, and a house that smelled of new money and old opinions, and who had never approved of David's choice of wife, and had let that disapproval settle over the years into something entrenched and self-righteous. Gerald, who had come to the funeral and stood at the grave with the expression of a man cataloging what he was owed. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first established Gerald's legal standing as David's nearest male relative. The second expressed concern. The word was italicized, which told her everything she needed to know about how genuine the concern was. For Lucy's welfare, given that she was being raised in an unstructured environment by a woman working in a service capacity in a male-dominated institution. The third paragraph stated that Gerald and Constance were prepared to provide Lucy with a proper home, proper schooling, and proper family, and that they would be consulting with an attorney about their options regarding Lucy's guardianship. She read it twice. Then she folded it and set it on the counter and stood very still for a moment. Hector was still in the kitchen. He was doing something with the lamp on the wall hook, adjusting it for no particular reason, which was his way of being present without intruding. "Did Cole read this?" she asked. "He didn't open it," Hector said, "but he could see who it was from on the envelope, and he asked me to make sure you got it promptly." She looked at the letter on the counter. "Gerald Mercer has no legal standing," she said. It came out flat, which was how she handled things that frightened her. She stated facts because facts were what she had. I'm Lucy's mother. He's her uncle by marriage, not by blood. He has no claim. I know, Hector said. But attorneys cost money, and a dispute costs time. And if he files anything, I'd have to respond. And to respond, I need... She stopped. She was thinking out loud, which was not her habit, and she pulled herself back. She picked up the letter and went to find Cole. He was in the office, at the desk, with the county map and a set of post-hearing documents spread in front of him. He looked up when she came in. She set the letter on the map in front of him without preamble. I need to tell you what's in this, she said. He read it. His face did not change while he read, but she had learned to read the small things. The slight tension at the corner of his jaw, the stillness that meant he was processing something that required careful handling. He read it twice, folded it the same way she had, and set it on the map. Gerald Mercer, he said. David's brother. He wasn't involved with us. He didn't visit, he didn't write, he came to the funeral, and that was the last I heard from him until now. He wants Lucy. He wants to have wanted Lucy, she said. The distinction came out cleanly, which surprised her a little. It was a thing she'd been thinking without knowing she'd put it in those terms. He doesn't want the child. He wants the standing that comes from taking the child from a woman he always thought was beneath his family. Cole was quiet for a moment. Do you have an attorney? No. Do you have documentation? Lucy's birth record, your marriage certificate, David's death? In my bag, she said. I've carried them since David died. I had some sense that this was a possible problem. He looked at her steadily. Perch handles family law. It's not his specialty, but he knows the relevant statutes. I'll write to him today. He paused. I want to be clear about something. This is not a situation that affects your position here. Whatever Gerald Mercer files or doesn't file, your place at Black Ridge is not contingent on it. She held his gaze. You don't have to. I'm aware I don't have to, he said. I'm telling you what I intend. She looked at him for a moment. Not because she was doubting the statement. She had learned to read Cole Barrett well enough to know when he meant exactly what he said, and this was one of those times. She was looking at him because she needed a moment to absorb it. 2 months ago, she had stood on his porch with a child in a bag in 60 seconds, and now the man who had looked at her with flat, careful neutrality was telling her that her place in his house was not contingent on a legal threat. Thank you, she said. Get me the documents when you have a moment, he said. I want Perch to see them before he writes back. She went to get the documents. She told Lucy that evening, not all of it. Lucy was 7, and 7-year-olds didn't need the full legal architecture of a custody dispute laid out for them. But she told her enough because she had always told Lucy enough, because she believed that children who weren't told things filled the silence with something worse than the truth. She told her that Uncle Gerald had written a letter saying he wanted Lucy to live with him and Aunt Constance, and that they were going to make sure that didn't happen. Lucy listened to this with the careful attention she gave to information she was deciding how to feel about. I don't want to live with Uncle Gerald, she said. I know. He smells like hair oil, and he never talked to me at the funeral. That's accurate. I want to stay here, Lucy said. She said it simply, without drama, as a statement of fact about herself. Then she looked at her mother with the directness she'd had since she was very small. Are we going to be able to? Evelyn looked at her daughter. She thought about the letter and Perch, and Cole sitting at his desk with the map and the documents and the particular steadiness of a man who had already made up his mind about something. She thought about what she could promise and what she couldn't, and about the fact that the gap between those two things was where most of the pain in a life happened. I believe so, she said. I can't tell you certainly, but I believe so, and I'm going to do everything I can to make it true. Lucy nodded. She appeared to find this acceptable. Then she said, Does Mr. Barrett know? Yes. What did he say? Evelyn thought about this for a moment. He said our place here isn't going to change because of Gerald's letter. Lucy processed this. That's good, she said. Yes, Evelyn said. It is. She tucked Lucy in and went back to the kitchen, and she stood at the counter for a while in the quiet of the late evening, the stove still warm from dinner, the bread rack empty, the larder door slightly ajar from the last time she'd checked the morning's supply. The letter from Gerald was on the counter where she'd left it. She picked it up and put it in the small wooden box where she kept her personal documents, next to Lucy's birth record and her marriage certificate and David's death notice. And she closed the box and put it on the shelf above the prep table where she could reach it easily. She was not afraid of Gerald Mercer. She had been for a moment, the flat, cold moment when she'd first read the letter and understood what it was. But the fear had a short life in her, shorter than it used to have, because she was not any more in the position she'd been in when she climbed onto Cutter's wagon, alone and uncertain and holding herself together by calculation and competence and the sheer refusal to let the calculation fail. She was still those things. The calculation was still running, the competence was still the backbone of everything. But she was not alone in the way she had been. Perch would write. Cole had said it, and Cole meant what he said. The documents were solid. She had been meticulous about her documents since David died, because she'd understood even then that a widow with a child and no family money was a person whose legal standing was only as good as the paper it was written on. Gerald's claim was weak. His standing was thin. His attorney, whoever it was, would tell him the same thing eventually, and Gerald was the kind of man who listened to attorneys. It would be all right. Not perfectly, not smoothly. There would be correspondence and probably some weeks of uncertainty, and possibly a formal response that cost money she didn't entirely have. But it would be all right. She banked the fire in the stove and washed the last of the prep dishes and dried her hands on the kitchen towel and hung it back on the hook. She was about to go to bed when she heard a knock on the kitchen door. The exterior one, which was unusual at this hour. She opened it. Silas Boone was standing on the step. He had his coat on and his hat in his hands, which was how he stood when he had something to say that he'd decided to say and wasn't entirely comfortable saying. Behind him, the yard was still and cold and very quiet under a sky full of stars. She waited. I heard there might be some legal trouble, he said. About the girl. She studied him. Where did you hear that? Hector mentioned it. He wasn't gossiping, Silas added, with a firmness that suggested he wanted that clearly established. He was worried. He mentioned it to me because... He stopped. Started again. Because I asked him how things were, and he told me. She leaned against the doorframe. It's being handled. I know. He turned his hat in his hands once. I wanted you to know, if there's anything I can say, in whatever way that's useful, about the girl's situation here, whether she's well looked after, whether the ranch is a fit environment. He said this with the stiff delivery of someone who had rehearsed several versions of it and wasn't fully satisfied with any of them. I've been here a long time. I know what this place is. If a judge or an attorney needed to know what this place is and whether a child belonged in it, my word on that would carry some weight. The yard was very quiet. Somewhere in the barn, a horse shifted. Evelyn looked at Silas Boone, at his gray beard and his weathered face and his hat turning in his hands, and the expression that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable, but was something true, whatever it was. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. It's just the facts of the situation, he said. That's all. He put his hat on. He started to turn back toward the bunkhouse, then stopped. The girl's territory behind the outbuildings. I checked it after the storm. The lean-to was down. I rebuilt it. She didn't say anything for a moment. She didn't mention that, Evelyn said. I did it when she wasn't out there, Silas said. I didn't want to fuss. He walked back toward the bunkhouse with the deliberate unhurriedness of a man who had done what he came to do and had no particular interest in talking about it. She stood in the kitchen doorway until he was gone. Then she went inside and closed the door and stood in the kitchen in the warm quiet and breathed. She thought about Gerald's letter, which was in the box on the shelf. She thought about Cole at his desk, already writing to Perch. She thought about Tom's shoulder and the blizzard and Dawson riding 18 miles in bad roads with her letter in his saddlebag. She thought about Morrow, walking into a courthouse at 81 years old with a leather case he'd been carrying for 16 years. She thought about Pete Callahan's laugh at dinner when Lucy said she wanted a ranch where she decided everything. She thought about the ledger she'd found behind the tomatoes on her first night and the barrel of salt and the marjoram that Silas's mother had used. She thought about Lucy asleep in the small room behind her, with the pale stone from the territory on the windowsill, and the territory itself standing outside in the cold with a rebuilt lean-to that a man who had once questioned whether she belonged here had repaired quietly, without wanting credit for it. She turned off the kitchen lamp. She would be up in 4 hours to start breakfast. Perch's response came 12 days after Cole wrote to him. Evelyn was in the kitchen when Cole brought the letter in, and he set it on the prep table beside her and sat down on the stool without being asked, which was how she knew the news was something he wanted to tell her in person rather than leave her to read alone. She dried her hands and picked up the letter and read it standing. Perch was characteristically direct. Gerald Mercer's claim had no viable legal foundation. Under territorial law, a surviving parent retained full custodial standing absent evidence of demonstrated harm or incapacity, and Gerald's letter, which Perch had reviewed, contained no evidence of either, only insinuation dressed in the language of concern. Perch had drafted a formal response to Gerald's attorney, if he had one, or to Gerald directly, stating Evelyn's legal position clearly and without aggression, the kind of letter that communicated in the specific tone of legal correspondence that the sender knew exactly where they stood and was not worried about it. He enclosed a copy for Evelyn to review. He also noted at the bottom of the letter that he had consulted 2 colleagues who confirmed his assessment. Gerald Mercer could pursue this, but he would spend a great deal of money to lose, and any competent attorney would advise him of that promptly. She read the enclosure. It was, as Perch described it, clean and certain and utterly without defensiveness, which was exactly the right tone. She read it twice and then set both letters down on the table. "He'll drop it," Cole said. "Probably," she agreed. Perch doesn't say probably when he means probably. He says probably when he means almost certainly. He looked at her across the table. "Gerald Mercer strikes me as the kind of man who files threats and retreats from the ones that cost him." She thought about Gerald at the funeral, his good coat and his careful condolences and his eyes already assessing, already calculating the arithmetic of who was left and what remained. "Yes," she said, "that's accurate." "Lucy stays," Cole said. She looked at him. He said it the same way he'd said things since the beginning, without ornamentation, without softening, just the fact of it, which was more reassuring than any number of more elaborate assurances would have been. She had come to understand that this was perhaps Cole Barrett's most significant quality, not his practicality, not his competence, not even his fundamental fairness, but the fact that what he said was exactly what he meant, no more and no less. And you could build on that the way you built on ground that had been tested. "Lucy stays," she said. A week later, Gerald Mercer's attorney wrote back to Perch. The letter was brief. Gerald had reconsidered his position and would not be pursuing the matter further. Perch forwarded it to Evelyn with a single line of his own appended at the bottom. "As anticipated, keep the documents in order. P." She put the letter in the box on the shelf, behind the birth record and the marriage certificate, and she closed the box and did not open it again. Winter settled over Black Ridge in the full, committed way of a season that had decided it was finished being tentative. The days shortened to a pale few hours of gray light bracketed by long, cold dark, and the work of the ranch contracted inward. Less range, more maintenance, the quiet, intensive labor of keeping animals and equipment and buildings functional against the cold. Snow came and stayed, which was different from the blizzard, which had come and moved on. This snow was patient. It accumulated in the corners of the yard and along the fence lines and on the roof of the barn, and it did not leave. The kitchen became the warmest room in the main house, which meant it became the room where people drifted when they had a reason to be inside. Hector spent more time at the prep table. Cole, who had previously done his evening work exclusively in the office, began taking his second cup of coffee in the kitchen sometimes, reading correspondence at the end of the table while she did the last of the evening prep or inventory work. She noticed this without commenting on it. He didn't explain it. It was simply a thing that happened gradually, the way the whole of Black Ridge had happened to her. Not by declaration, but by accumulation, one day at a time. Pete Callahan, emboldened by winter idleness, started telling his stories in the kitchen after dinner on the evenings when the cold made the bunkhouse less appealing than the warmth of the main house. This was technically a breach of some unspoken protocol about the separation between kitchen space and social space, and Evelyn was aware that a different cook might have enforced that separation. She did not. She let Pete talk, and she let the men who drifted in to listen drift in, and she worked around them and occasionally corrected factual errors in Pete's stories with the calm precision of someone who couldn't help it, which Pete found hilarious and which the men found entertaining for reasons she didn't entirely understand. Even Silas came, twice. He sat near the exterior door and drank coffee and said nothing, which was not different from how he behaved in the dining room, but the choice to come was different. She understood the difference. One evening, a particularly cold Thursday in January, the kind where the wind found the gaps in the walls and the lamps all flickered together as though responding to something outside, Lucy came to the kitchen doorway in her nightgown with the determined expression of a child who had decided that the hour was irrelevant and the kitchen was where she needed to be. Pete was mid-story. Ellis was on the stool near the window. Tom, whose shoulder had healed cleanly, was sitting on an upturned crate. Cole was at the end of the table with a cup of coffee. Lucy looked at the assembly without particular surprise and found a place on the bench beside Ellis and sat down. Nobody sent her back to bed. Pete continued the story. Lucy listened with the focused attention she brought to things that interested her, and after a while Ellis said something to her quietly, too low for Evelyn to hear across the kitchen, and Lucy said something back, and Ellis laughed in the easy, uncomplicated way of a young man who had found his footing somewhere and wasn't anxious about it anymore. Evelyn was at the stove with her back to the room, and she did not turn around because if she turned around she was going to feel something that she preferred to feel privately, and the kitchen was not a private room tonight. She kept her hands on the work and let the sounds of the room wash over her. Pete's voice, the wind outside, the stove's steady heat, Lucy's occasional precise observation delivered in her matter-of-fact way, Cole's quiet at the end of the table. And she understood, standing there, that she had stopped waiting. She had been waiting since they arrived. Waiting for the trial week to end, waiting for the next problem, waiting for Gerald's letter, waiting for the storm to pass, waiting for the ruling, waiting to know whether Black Ridge was real or provisional. She had kept one part of herself held back, the way you held something back from a fire you weren't sure you should trust. And she had been so practiced at holding back that she hadn't noticed until this moment that at some point, she couldn't have said when, she had stopped doing it. She was not held back. She was here. That was not nothing. It was in fact the thing she had been working toward since before she'd known she was working toward it. She asked Cole directly, in February. Not about her feelings. She was not someone who performed that kind of conversation, and neither was he. And she had no interest in mishandling something important by forcing it into a shape it didn't fit. She asked him about the ranch, about what he needed, about whether what she'd been doing since November was what he'd expected when she arrived, and whether it was what he wanted going forward. They were in the office, the same room where she'd shown him the ledger in her first week, and the situation felt different enough from that conversation to notice. She was sitting in the chair across from his desk comfortably, without the formal tension of a person making a case, and he was sitting at the desk without the careful neutrality of a man reserving judgment. "You didn't hire a cook," she said. "You got considerably more than a cook." "I noticed," he said. I want to know what Black Ridge needs going forward, from me, what the actual situation is." He looked at her steadily. "The actual situation," he said, "is that this ranch runs better than it has in years. The men eat well. The supplies are managed properly. The accounts are clean. I nearly lost the eastern section because Greer had been working against me for a year, and the reason I didn't lose it is sitting across from me right now." He said this without sentiment, which was the only way he could say things that would have sounded like flattery if he'd said them with sentiment. Coming from him, stated plainly, they were just facts. What Black Ridge needs going forward is what it has. She looked at him. "I want Lucy to be able to grow up here. She already is. I want that to be not a provisional arrangement. I want it to be the arrangement." Cole was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about that," he said, "since before Gerald's letter, if I'm being straight with you. Since around the time of the storm, if I'm being more precise." She waited. "I'm not a man who says things before he's certain of them," he said. "I've been making sure I was certain before I said anything." He looked at his hands briefly. A gesture she'd never seen from him before, the involuntary look of a person checking themselves, then back at her. "I'd like you and Lucy to stay. Not as cook, not as... I don't want there to be a job description for what I'm asking. I'm asking whether you want to build something here, whether this is the place you want to be. Not because you have nowhere else to go." The last sentence was the important one. Not because you have nowhere else to go. He'd seen her well enough to know that that sentence mattered. that she needed the distinction between staying because she had no better option and staying because she chose it, because one of those was survival and the other was something else entirely. "I want to be here," she said. "That's the honest answer." He nodded once. "Then you're here." It was not a romantic declaration. It was not a scene from anything. It was two people who had spent 3 months learning each other through the medium of hard work and difficult circumstances, establishing, in the plainest possible terms, that they intended to continue. The rest would come in its own time. In the gradual way things between people who didn't rush their feelings tended to come, through shared mornings and difficult evenings and all the ordinary negotiations of a life conducted in close proximity to another person. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, what she had always wanted. Not a declaration, but a decision. Not a promise of perfection, but a commitment to be present. She knew the difference, had learned it the hard way, and she understood that what Cole Barrett had just offered her was the latter, and that the latter was what actually held. Spring arrived the way it always did on the high plains, abruptly, imperfectly, with mud and false warmth and a last hard frost in April that killed the early growth and made everyone who'd been optimistic feel foolish, and then eventually, undeniably, the real thing. The territory survived the winter in better shape than anyone expected. The lean-to Silas had rebuilt, held against the snow. The rocks and the marker sticks were mostly in place, displaced in some sections by freeze and thaw, but recognizable. And Lucy set about the restoration with the practical purposefulness of a person who understood that things required maintenance and considered that a feature of things worth keeping rather than an argument against keeping them. She had, over the winter, added to the territory in ways that reflected her expanding familiarity with Black Ridge. There was a barn now, built from flat stones, and a section she called the kitchen, which was marked off with a ring of small pebbles, and near the eastern edge a low structure of stacked sticks that she referred to without explanation as the legal office. Evelyn did not ask about the legal office. Some things were better appreciated without explanation. Ellis had developed, over the course of the winter, a specific expertise in the territory's geography. He knew which sections flooded in the spring melt, which marker stones were original, and which had been replaced after the storm, and he had at some point been granted the designation of what Lucy called the foreman of the North Section, a title he appeared to take seriously. Tom assisted occasionally with structural questions, applying what he knew about fence building to the particular engineering challenges of the territory's perimeter, and he did this with a straight face that Evelyn found entirely endearing. Silas had not returned to the territory after rebuilding the lean-to, but he'd checked on it twice in January during the cold stretches, going out in the early morning before anyone was up, not saying anything to anyone. Hector told Evelyn this with the quiet satisfaction of a person reporting good news they'd been waiting to see confirmed. She didn't say anything to Silas about it. He would not have wanted her to. But she thought about it, and what she thought was this, that the capacity to change was not loud in most people. It didn't announce itself. It happened in the small, private actions that people took when they thought nobody was watching. The rebuilt lean-to, the checked perimeter, the cup of coffee refilled without a word. Silas Boone had not turned into a different person over the winter. He was still the man he'd been, with his fixed ideas about tradition and order and the way things should be done. But somewhere in the months of watching Evelyn run the kitchen through a fraud investigation and a legal battle and a blizzard and a custody threat and come out the other side with the accounts balanced and the men fed and the ranch intact, he had found room to revise one of his certainties, and he had revised it quietly. And that was its own kind of honesty. She respected it more, in some ways, than if he'd made a production of changing his mind. Oh. The evening of the first warm day in May, genuinely warm, the kind of day where you could stand in the yard without a coat and feel the sun as something substantive rather than theoretical. Cole came into the kitchen while she was making dinner and stood in the doorway and said, "Come outside for a minute." She turned from the stove. "It'll hold," he said. She followed him out to the yard. The light was long and golden in the late afternoon way of early summer, the kind of light that made the high plains look like a painting of themselves rather than the real thing. The mountains in the far distance had lost most of their snow. The yard smelled of mud and new grass, and the particular clean smell of air that had been cold for a long time and was only now releasing what it had been holding. Cole stood beside her in the yard and looked at the ranch,
The main building, the barn, the outbuildings, the fences running off toward the eastern section that was legally and unambiguously his, the windmill turning slowly in the May air. He looked at it the way people looked at things they had nearly lost and then hadn't. My father built this in 1869, he said. 2 men and a wagon and a lease on land that wasn't worth much yet. He was quiet a moment. He worked it for 12 years, and then he got sick, and I came back from a cattle operation in New Mexico and took it over. That was 8 years ago. He looked at the fence line. I've spent 8 years just trying to keep it what he built. It's more than what he built, she said. That's what I'm getting to. He looked at her. The low sun was in his face, and he was squinting slightly against it, which gave him a different expression than usual. More open, less composed. I've been running this place like a man defending a position, not building anything, just holding what I had and fighting off what I didn't want. A pause. I didn't know that's what I was doing until someone came along who was actually building something, right in the middle of my defensive operation, and I didn't even notice until it was already built. She looked at the yard. At the kitchen garden she'd started in March, a modest rectangle of turned earth beside the south wall, staked and planned, not yet growing much, but committed. At the small wooden sign she'd nailed above the kitchen door at Pete's insistence, no words, just a burned mark she'd made with the end of a fireplace poker. A simple thing, but hers. At the territory, visible from here in its spring reconstruction, Lucy's voice carrying faintly from behind the outbuildings where she was directing Ellis in some structural project. I didn't come here to build anything, Evelyn said. I came here because I needed work, and you needed a cook. I know, Cole said. That's the funny part. He was quiet a moment. I don't think I needed a cook at all. I think I needed what I got, and I didn't know what that was until I had it. She thought about what he was saying and what he wasn't saying, and the space between them that was comfortable in a way it hadn't been 3 months ago and hadn't needed to be announced as comfortable, because they'd both simply arrived there through the accumulation of ordinary days. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I know, he said. And then, because he was Cole Barrett, and he said things plainly or not at all. I'd like it to be official, whatever that takes. Whenever you're ready, there's no rush. He looked at her with the steady directness that was as characteristic of him as his jaw or his hands. I just want you to know the offer is there. Standing, not conditional. She looked at him for a moment. The sun was behind his shoulder now, and the yard was golden and imperfect, and smelled of new grass, and the kitchen behind them had a pot on the stove that was going to need attention in about 10 minutes. All right, she said. He nodded. All right. They went back inside. Os. There's a particular thing that happens when you've spent most of your life being someone who handles things. You get very good at the handling, and very bad at accepting that the handling has become unnecessary. You keep waiting for the next problem. You keep your weight forward, ready to move, because that's what you trained yourself to do, and the training doesn't stop just because the emergency has passed. Evelyn didn't stop waiting all at once. It happened the way most real things happened. Gradually, without announcement, through the evidence of ordinary days that did not require crisis management. She would notice, making bread on a Tuesday morning, that she was not calculating anything, not the next supply gap, or the next legal threat, or the next thing that needed her to hold it together. She was just making bread. The stove was doing what she'd learned to make it do. The light came in the east window the way it came every morning. Lucy's voice was in the yard. Hector was in the hall. Cole's horse was in the corral. She was not surviving Black Ridge. She was living in it. That was the thing nobody told you about the life you were trying to build. That the building of it was invisible, that you couldn't see it happening, that you only knew it had happened when you looked up one morning and the place you were standing was not the place you'd been standing before, and you'd walked there one ordinary step at a time. She thought sometimes about the woman who had climbed onto Cutter's wagon in November with a 7-year-old and a bag of documents and 60 seconds worth of argument. That woman had been competent and clear-eyed and completely alone in the way of people who have decided that alone is the only thing they can afford to be. She did not miss being that woman, but she understood her. Understood the calculation, the careful withholding, the way you kept yourself manageable when the world was not. You did what you had to do to get to the next place. And then you got to the next place, and if you were careful and a little lucky and willing to work harder than was strictly fair, the next place turned out to be somewhere worth staying.
Lucy understood this better than anyone because Lucy had not needed to unlearn anything. She had arrived at Black Ridge and assessed it with the open, undefended attention of a child and found it worthy and begun building her territory. And she had been right from the first day in a way that her mother had taken months to catch up to. There was a lesson in that, if you wanted one. Children trusted what adults had spent years learning not to trust, the evidence of the present moment, the reality of what was actually in front of them. Lucy had looked at the brown gelding by the corral fence and known immediately he was worth talking to. She had looked at Ellis and known he was harmless and kind. She had looked at the alcove between the outbuildings and seen immediately that it was the right place for a territory. She had not needed the ranch to prove itself. She had simply begun. Evelyn had needed the proof, had needed months of it, the daily accumulation of evidence that Black Ridge was real and that her place in it was real and that the people in it were what they appeared to be. That was not a flaw. It was the appropriate response of a person who had been burned enough times to understand that trust was not free. But she had gotten there. Slower than Lucy, and with more calculation, and without the child's instinctive grace. But she had gotten there. On a Sunday evening in late May, the first evening warm enough to eat outside, someone, Pete, she suspected, though he denied it, carried 2 of the dining room benches into the yard and the men ate dinner in the open air for the first time since October. Evelyn brought the food out and set it on the planks that were laid across 2 sawhorses, an impromptu table, the kind of arrangement that happened when a group of people had been living together long enough to stop needing everything to be formal. Lucy sat between Ellis and Tom and ate with the unselfconscious ease of a child who had forgotten to be anywhere but home. Cole sat at one end, Pete at the other. And the conversation was the ordinary conversation of people who knew each other. Complaints about a fence section, a story about a horse Ellis had lost track of, and then found standing peacefully in the exact spot where he'd last looked. The question of whether it would stay warm enough for the early planting Evelyn had been planning. Silas was at the far end of the bench. He ate without talking, which was his way. But at one point he looked down the table at Lucy, and she looked back at him, and he said, "The north section of your territory is going to flood in June. Creek runs high. You should move the boundary markers up." Lucy looked at him with the seriousness the topic deserved. "How far up?" 6 inches, maybe. Depends on the snow melt." She nodded. "I'll do it tomorrow." "Smart," Silas said, and went back to his food. Evelyn watched this from her end of the table and said nothing. The evening was long and warm, and the mountains in the distance went from gold to pink to gray as the sun moved, and someone found a harmonica, and Pete's stories went on longer than usual, and nobody was in a hurry to go in. The lanterns were lit when it finally got dark enough to need them, and they sat in the lantern light, and the warm air and the stars came out above them one at a time until the whole sky was full of them. Cole was beside her, not saying much. He didn't need to say much. He had never been a man who filled silence unnecessarily, and she had come to find his particular quiet companionable in the way of things you learn to appreciate rather than things you started out appreciating. "Good dinner," he said. "Same dinner I make every Sunday," she said. "Tastes better outside." She looked at the yard, the lanterns, the men, Lucy's voice still going somewhere at the other end, the barn solid against the dark sky, the eastern fence line out there in the dark that was his and was going to stay his. "Yes," she said. "It does." She was not a woman who had gotten everything she wanted. She had lost a husband and spent a year and a half on the edge of things, and the edge had been cold, and she had been tired in ways she hadn't fully let herself know until she wasn't tired that way anymore. There were things she couldn't undo and bills she was still paying in ways that didn't involve money. Life did not resolve cleanly. She knew that, and she wasn't asking it to. But she was here, in this yard, on this ground, with her daughter's voice in the warm air, and a man beside her who meant what he said and said what he meant. And the kitchen behind her was hers in the way that mattered. And the territory behind the outbuildings was staked and mapped and ready for its June restoration. And the stars were very bright above the high plains, and the night was warm, and she was, for the first time in a long time, simply and completely present in the life she was living. That was not nothing. That was in fact everything.